No one knows exactly how many bodies lie beneath Washington Square Park. 20,000 is the cautious estimate. Some researchers say darker things. No one knows what still waits inside the oldest tunnel in America, sealed beneath Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, a tunnel that vanished from the city's own records for more than a century, until a teenager with a flashlight walked back in and found it still there. And no one strolling above Broadway tonight knows that behind a wall the city forgot, deep in the dark, a piano still stands in the waiting room of a subway that was never allowed to exist. This is a story about New York City, but not the skyline. This is a story about what is really buried beneath the streets, the hidden rivers that still move under the pavement, the sealed platforms no train will ever stop at again, the forgotten villages, the unmarked graves, the rooms the city sealed and then forgot it sealed. Tonight we descend, slowly, layer by layer, through ice, stone, water, and memory, into the underground of America's most vertical city, where the strangest things are not the tunnels you can see, but the ones you cannot. Nothing in New York is permanent. Nothing was ever permanent. The land itself is layered biography. Tonight, quietly, we will read it. To begin, we go back, far back, long before the streets were ever drawn, long before the aqueducts, the subway tunnels, the piling of foundations, the caissons being driven through sand and schist for the foundations of the next skyline. We go back 19,000 years, to the last great ice age, to the moment when Manhattan was not an island at all. Manhattan was part of a continent. It sat beneath ice more than 2,000 feet thick, an enormous slow-moving sheet of frozen water that had bulldozed its way south from Canada, scraping, polishing, gouging, dumping. That ice would become the shape of every borough you have ever seen, and it would also shape the layered underworld we are descending into tonight. The Wisconsin ice sheet, the last of the great North American glaciers, reached New York between roughly 22,000 and 20,000 years ago. It covered the entire region, it covered Manhattan Island, it covered the upper New York Bay, it covered Long Island, which is actually a terminal moraine, which means Long Island is essentially a pile of the glacier's leftover rubble. The Brooklyn Bridge sits on the bulldozings of an ice sheet. Below the ice, the geology was preparing the ground modern New York would eventually build on. The bedrock that holds up the skyscrapers, the famous Manhattan schist, was already there. It was already nearly 500 million years old. It just had not yet been discovered. And before the ice arrived, the rock had been formed in deep ocean conditions, folded, baked, metamorphosed into the hard, dense, layered material that today supports the financial center of the planet. That bedrock currently sits between roughly 18 feet below the surface in Midtown, near Times Square, and 260 feet below the surface in Lower Greenwich Village. That variation alone explains a great deal about why some parts of the city rose tall, while others had to wait. The geological truth of Manhattan is that it is high in the middle and lower at the edges, and that this high center of bedrock, mostly visible in Morningside Heights and Washington Heights, is the spine of the borough. The rest is filled in. The rest of the island is, in a quietly critical sense, manufactured land. Much of what we call downtown Manhattan is on top of fill, placed there by hand, by barge, by the labor of an entire 19th century. So when we say buried something about Manhattan, you have to mean both stories, the asphalt and the schist, the street level and the geological level, and in between them, dozens of buried layers, some of which were built deliberately, some of which simply accumulated. To really enter these buried layers, we need a method. Tonight, we will travel down through New York the way one might peel a very old city. First, we will go to the most recent burials, the histories that were buried within the last 200 years, lost neighborhoods, lost cemeteries, lost water. Then we will descend into more deliberate burials, the engineered underworlds, aqueducts, sewers, abandoned subway platforms, sealed pneumatic tubes, a forgotten rail siding beneath a famous hotel. Finally, we will keep descending all the way down to the ice and the bedrock, the long burials, the layers that no human being has decided to put there. From there, sleep, if it comes, can come gently, because by that point the city we live in will feel less like a fixed place, and more like a moving layer in a very long process. So, we begin. Not with the buried water of New York, although we will get there. We begin with the most haunting buried thing of all, a deliberate erasure. Before we go any deeper into the ground, a small, quiet note. If this story is helping you unwind tonight, consider tapping the like button. It tells the algorithm that quiet, slow stories like this have a place here, and it helps other sleepers find their way down. Subscribe if you want more journeys like this one, and leave a comment with the city you are listening from tonight. New York, Berlin, Sao Paulo, anywhere. The buried layers under your city are probably older than you think. Now, back down into the ground, every great modern city contains at least one erased neighborhood. New York contains more than most, and one of the most unsettling is the one that was removed to make Central Park possible. Long before the park was designed, before Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted ever walked the rocky, swampy ground that would one day be the park, the land was not empty. It held a community, it held farms, it held homes, it held 3 churches, a school, and one of Manhattan's only significant cemeteries for free Black New Yorkers. Its name was Seneca Village, and it began in 1825 when a pair of landowners named John and Elizabeth Whitehead subdivided their property between what is now 82nd and 89th Streets, between what is now 7th and 8th Avenues, and sold 200 lots, mostly to African American families who could not easily find property elsewhere in Manhattan. By the early 1850s, the village had roughly 300 residents. It had 2 schools, one of which was specifically for Black children. It had 3 churches, including the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Many of the village families owned their land outright, which was rare even for white residents of the period. Seneca Village was not a slum. It was not a shantytown. It was not a settlement on someone else's property. It was land that Black New Yorkers owned and that they had built a real community on. Then the park arrived, and the village was erased. The state legislature used eminent domain to take the land. The residents were paid, but not generously. Some were paid less than what they had refused to sell for years earlier. Some were moved abruptly. Some lost parts of what they had built. And Seneca Village was simply removed. The structures came down. The fields were regraded. Olmsted and Vaux's pastoral vision of meadows and lakes and hidden bridges was laid directly on top of 300 lived lives. Today, if you walk into Central Park near the 85th Street transverse, you are walking over the foundations of homes. You are walking over the allotments of a community whose descendants, even now, are still being identified. The park is one of the great triumphs of American landscape architecture, and it is also one of the great quiet erasures of 19th century New York. Beneath its carefully groomed lawns, beneath its soft hills, beneath its carriage drives and bridle paths, the village survives. Footings survive. Cisterns survive. A cemetery survives. They lie under the surface, sometimes only a few feet down. The buried village is not deep enough to be mythical. It is shallow enough to be reachable, and yet the city that grew around it preferred not to remember it. We do not stay in Central Park. The buried city is larger than one park, and we have several more stops yet to go. A short walk south, into Greenwich Village, brings us to Washington Square Park. The park today is known for its arch, for its fountain, for its chess players, for its students, for its dog walkers. It is a postcard. But its ground has memory, and the memory is not gentle. From roughly 1797 to 1820, Washington Square Park was a potter's field, a public burial ground for the city's poor, the unknown, and the victims of epidemics. The yellow fever outbreaks of 1797, 1798, 1801, and 1803 overwhelmed the city's burial capacity. Existing cemeteries filled up, and so the city opened a new burial ground here in what was then the edge of town, near a creek that ran toward the Hudson. That creek, by the way, was Minetta Brook, and we will come back to Minetta Brook later, because it too is a buried thing and it still flows. Bodies at the Potter's Field were buried by the thousands, often in shallow graves, often in unmarked trenches. Today, archaeological work and historic records suggest that roughly 20,000 people are still buried beneath Washington Square Park. Some estimates go higher. Whatever the precise number is, it is large enough that the park would feel very different if those bodies were visible. The park's 2005 archaeological assessment concluded that the burial ground is still largely intact beneath the lawns, and that any major excavation in the park would almost certainly disturb it. That truth exists quietly beneath every Sunday chess game, beneath every concert, Beneath every graduation photo at the Arch, the square is built on bones. A few blocks east of Washington Square Park on Broadway is Trinity Churchyard. Trinity Church was established in 1697. The churchyard surrounding it is one of the oldest continuously maintained burial grounds in Manhattan. The oldest legible gravestone in the park belongs to a 5-year-old child named Richard Churcher, and it dates to 1681. There are Federalists buried here. There are members of the early New York elite buried here. There are also enslaved people buried here, which is part of a much larger story about the African presence in colonial New York, a presence that the city has only recently begun to fully acknowledge. The interesting thing about Trinity Churchyard for our purposes tonight is not its famous graves, but its continuity. Trinity Church remained above ground. It was retained. Its churchyard was retained. So Trinity gives us a glimpse of what older New York burying grounds looked like before they were erased, since most of the others were not so lucky. Trinity stayed. Most others did not. By the early 19th century, Manhattan's burial grounds were overcapacity, poorly maintained, and a source of public health alarm. Yellow fever, cholera, typhoid, all of them surged through neighborhoods built up against the edges of overcrowded graveyards. In 1822, the city passed a law that banned most burials below Canal Street. The older churchyards were quietly closed. Many were not preserved. Many were paved over, built on, forgotten. St. Paul's Chapel graveyard nearby was partially lost to construction. The Zion Church burial ground on Lower Mott Street was built over. The St. Mark's churchyard in the East Village was exhausted by mid-century and then built over by tenements. The ground under much of Lower Manhattan is layered with these forgotten burials, which is one of the reasons construction in that part of the city is so expensive. You do not just dig a foundation. You negotiate with the dead. The African burial ground is the most famous and the most fully excavated of these rediscovered cemeteries. In 1991, workers excavating a federal office building at 290 Broadway uncovered human remains approximately 30 feet below street level. The Federal General Services Administration announced the discovery on October 8, 1991, and over the next several years, archaeologists recovered the intact and fragmented remains of 419 individuals and estimated that somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 people may ultimately be buried in the 6-acre site. This had been the burial ground for enslaved and free Africans of colonial New York, used in the 17th and 18th centuries, before the city closed the burial ground in 1794, and the city simply grew on top of it. The discovery forced a national conversation about whose history gets to remain above ground and whose history gets buried literally beneath later development. Today, the African burial ground is a national monument near the foot of Broadway. It is still only a few stories below working skyscrapers. The rest of the burial ground is still under buildings, under streets, under sidewalk. It is treated in practice as a small protected island inside the busy city above it. Burial grounds were not the only things being buried in early New York. The entire natural water system was being buried at the same time. Walk Lower Manhattan today, near what is now Foley Square, and you are walking over what was once a 60-foot deep freshwater pond. Its name was Collect Pond, sometimes called Freshwater Pond. It was approximately 48 acres. It was fed by an underground spring. For the first 2 centuries of New York's history, Collect Pond was the city's main source of drinking water. It was distributed to most of the city's 22,000 residents, mostly through hollowed-out logs used as pipes. Then industry arrived: breweries, slaughterhouses, tanneries. The contaminated wastewater from those businesses flowed back into the pond. By the late 18th century, Collect Pond was septic. The water was foul. The smell was, by contemporary accounts, terrible. The city decided to fill the pond. Work began in 1808. By 1811, the landfill was largely complete. The fill was done poorly. The land around the pond was already marshy. After the fill, it stayed marshy. It stayed waterlogged. It stayed prone to disease. The neighborhood that developed on that poorly drained fill became 5 Points, named for the 5-way intersection that formed over the eastern shore of the buried pond. 5 Points became, in the 19th century, the most notorious slum in North America. Gangs formed there. Poverty concentrated there. Cholera epidemics tore through it. The buildings sank unevenly because the buried fill kept settling. The whole neighborhood was literally sinking into a filled pond. Today, Collect Pond Park exists as a small green space near the courthouses, just a few inches deep over the original spring, and most passersby do not know that a 60-foot lake ever existed under their feet. Collect Pond is a model for understanding the rest of Lower Manhattan. The landfill job of 1811 taught the city's engineers that you could fill water. You could fill tide flats, you could fill wetlands, you could fill a pond and call the result land, and so they did. Again and again, for the next 150 years, the city expanded itself by burying its own water. Mill Pond, to the north, was drained and filled in the 1820s. The Lower East Side tide flats were filled in stages. The western shore of Manhattan filled itself outward into the Hudson, sometimes by accident, mostly by design, using everything from excavated rock to garbage, which brings us gently back to the buried water. Because the filling of visible water was not the same thing as killing the water. The water did not stop existing. It was redirected. It was enclosed in stone and brick. It was forced underground, and many of New York's buried streams still flow. Minetta Brook is the most famous of these. Before the city filled in its tributaries, Minetta Brook took its source from a spring near what is now 28th Street and 6th Avenue, then flowed south and east across the village, eventually emptying into the Hudson. The brook gave the neighborhood its older name. It was channeled underground in 1823 by order of the city's Common Council. A stone aqueduct was built around it. The creek was not killed, the creek was buried, and it still flows, according to multiple modern studies, beneath Minetta Lane, beneath Minetta Street, beneath the pavement of the village, and some hydrologists believe that its waters eventually emerge, transformed through the city's combined sewer outfalls, into the Hudson. The buried brook is one of the reasons the village floods so easily during heavy rain. The water table is still Minetta. The buried water table remembers Tibbetts Brook is another. In the Bronx, Tibbetts Brook once flowed south from Van Cortlandt Park, all the way down through Kingsbridge and into the Harlem River. It was a real surface river, the kind a person could walk along. By the 1890s, the city had begun to bury it. The process accelerated between roughly 1890 and 1910, alongside streetcar tracks, gas lines, and elevated rail. By 1912, the southern stretch of Tibbetts Brook had been diverted underground, sent down into the sewer pipes, lost. Today, more than a century later, the city is actively daylighting parts of Tibbetts Brook, which is the planning term for bringing a buried stream back to the surface. The buried brook is not dead. The buried brook is being exhumed, slowly, in the same neighborhoods that buried it 100 years ago. Modern New York is slowly learning that its underground rivers are not just infrastructure. They are still rivers. The buried water is not only fresh. The buried coastline is significant too. The original shoreline of Manhattan was significantly closer to its center than it is now. The Battery in 1609 was the southern tip of a much narrower island. The East River docks of today are built on fill. Brooklyn Bridge Park, in fact, sits almost entirely on filled land. So does much of Williamsburg's industrial waterfront. So does Lower Manhattan's Pier District. So does half of the Jersey City skyline you see from the Battery. The buried coastline is not just a tourist fact. The buried coastline is a major reason the city's geology varies so dramatically street by street, why Lower Manhattan can flood from a moderate storm while Upper Manhattan stays dry, why the buried creeks and tide channels still carry water even centuries after they were filled. When we talk about buried New York, the coast itself is part of the burial. Now we descend further into the engineered underworld. New York's first great buried water system, in the modern sense, was the Croton Aqueduct. The old Croton Aqueduct was a 45-mile conduit that brought fresh water from the Croton River in Westchester down into Manhattan by gravity without pumps. Construction began in 1837, and water first flowed into the city through the system on June 22, 1842. The water entered Manhattan at the Harlem River, crossed the river on the High Bridge, then flowed down through Manhattan in a covered masonry channel, eventually feeding two large reservoirs, one of which sat where the New York Public Library stands today, and the other of which sat where the great lawn of Central Park is. The aqueduct was deliberately buried in places and deliberately exposed in others, which is partly why the old Croton Aqueduct has become the longest continuous pedestrian route in New York State. It still exists in segments. You can walk it. Most of its route is buried underneath suburban lawns. Some of its route is still visible, including the famous High Bridge over the Harlem River. That bridge, completed in 1848, is itself a kind of aqueduct thing, and it carried water long before it carried people. The Croton Aqueduct is also the first example we will see tonight of an idea that repeats through the city's hidden infrastructure. The modern city was built on the bones of an earlier city, and then the earlier city was buried, only to be rediscovered again as historical curiosity or romantic object. The old Croton Aqueduct brought clean water. New York's modern Croton system, hidden entirely beneath the surface on a wholly different alignment, still brings clean water. Two Croton aqueducts, one above and one below, both still operating, both still pouring fresh water into the city from the same original watershed. Now we go to a very different kind of buried transit. In 1869 and 1870, a New York publisher and inventor named Alfred Ely Beach, editor of Scientific American, secretly built a pneumatic subway beneath Broadway. Beach had been advocating for years for an underground transit system in New York, and he decided to prove it was possible by building one himself beneath the city's feet, below the newspaper offices at the Rogers Peet Building, from Warren Street to Murray Street. The tunnel was 300 feet long, 8 feet in diameter, with a single car propelled by a giant fan, driven by steam at the far end. It opened on February 26, 1870. It was a sensation. New Yorkers paid 50 cents each to ride a single car through a tunnel beneath Broadway, lit by gaslight, lined with wood paneling, furnished with a piano. Beach applied for permission to extend the tunnel up Broadway all the way to Central Park. Permission was denied. Tammany Hall, which had its own interests in the city's transit franchises, refused to allow the pneumatic subway to expand. Beach's tunnel operated as a kind of exhibition until April 1873. It was then sealed. The fan was removed. The entrance was bricked shut. The tunnel was effectively forgotten. Then, in 1912, workers excavating for the BMT Broadway line, the line that still carries the NR and W trains today, broke through into Beach's old tunnel. They found the original pneumatic car inside. They found the tunneling shield. They found the piano in the waiting room. All of it had survived, sealed and silent for almost 40 years beneath Broadway. The BMT construction then filled Beach's tunnel again. It was buried for a second time. It sits there still, somewhere beneath the modern subway. The Beach Pneumatic Transit is one of New York's purest examples of the burial impulse. A new technology was built. The new technology was rejected. The new technology was sealed. The new technology was rediscovered. The new technology was buried again, by accident, by the needs of the next generation. That is the rhythm of the buried city. Things get buried, things get forgotten, things sometimes get remembered, and then they get buried all over again. Roughly across the East River, in Brooklyn, there is another example, and it is older. In 1844, the Long Island Railroad built a tunnel under Atlantic Avenue in what was then the small town of Brooklyn. Construction began in May 1844. The tunnel opened for use on December 3, 1844. It was not fully complete until mid-845. It is called, by different sources, the Cobble Hill Tunnel and the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel. It ran for 2,517 feet beneath Atlantic Avenue. It was the first tunnel of its kind in North America, the oldest subway tunnel in the world, and one of the few railroad tunnels of its era. It was used by LIRA trains for almost 2 decades. Then, in 1861, the New York State Legislature banned railroad locomotives inside the city limits of Brooklyn, mostly in response to public outcry after a series of accidents. The tunnel was closed. Property owners along Atlantic Avenue were assessed to defray the closure costs. The tunnel's entrances were sealed. The structure of the tunnel was reused for several purposes in the decades that followed, sometimes as a drainage channel, sometimes as a pedestrian passage, sometimes as a conduit. Then it was forgotten entirely. For roughly 119 years, the tunnel existed beneath Atlantic Avenue without anyone in the city openly acknowledging its extent. New buildings went up around it. Roads were resurfaced above it. The neighborhood around it, Cobble Hill, grew around it. Then, in 1980, A 20-year-old high school student named Bob Diamond began exploring local sewers as a hobby and gradually reconstructed the extraordinary truth that a complete, sealed, almost intact railroad tunnel lay beneath the busy shopping street above him. Diamond publicized the tunnel, founded the Brooklyn Historic Railway Association, and spent decades trying to reopen it for public use. The tunnel is still partially accessible today through narrow access shafts, and its preservation continues to be the subject of active debate. Most New Yorkers who walk Atlantic Avenue do not know that the oldest subway tunnel in North America is directly beneath them. The trains of the present pass, in a sense, above the trains of the past. The buried rail continues elsewhere. The City Hall station of the IRT subway opened on October 27, 1904, as the southern terminus of the very first line of the New York City subway. It was designed to feel like no other transit station. Its architects were Hines and Lafarge. Its interior was shaped by Rafael Guastavino, the engineer of the Catalan tile arch, whose curved, self-supporting tile ceilings appear in Grand Central Terminal and in many of New York's most beautiful interiors. The City Hall station featured Guastavino tile skylights, brass chandeliers, colored glass and Roman brick, marble wainscoting, blue and white faience plaques, and a curved, single island platform that followed the loop the trains used to turn around. It was, for its era, the crown jewel of American urban transit. The station closed on December 31, 1945, because its curved platform could not accommodate the longer subway cars that the city had started to run. The new trains were 10 cars long. The new trains could not fit through the old loop. So instead of rebuilding the station, the city simply shut it down, kept the loop operational for train turnaround, and left the platform abandoned. The chandeliers are still there. The skylights are still there. The Guastavino tile is still there. If you ride the southbound 6 train past the Brooklyn Bridge station and you do not get off, you can see the City Hall station lit up as your train curves around the old loop. The abandoned station is still there. It is still decorated in nearly original condition. It is one of the most spectacular abandoned places in the United States, and the city rarely opens it to the public at all. The abandoned platforms do not stop at City Hall. Across the system, the subway hides approximately a dozen fully abandoned stations. Court Street in downtown Brooklyn, the lower level of the old Nevin Street station, the 18th Street station on the IRT Lexington, parts of Dean Street, the unused platforms at Chambers Street, the old South Ferry Loop, the 91st Street station on the IRT, the Botanic Garden station. The list is long. Each of these stations is north of 100 years old. Each one was closed because of a rerouting, a service change, or the simple fact that the system outgrew its original architecture. Each one is sealed, dark, and largely intact. They are not ruins. They are merely forgotten rooms inside a working transit system. The subway map draws neat lines over them. They sit underneath. They wait. Their chandeliers and their tile vaults are slowly decaying in some cases. In other cases, they have been preserved in nearly perfect condition. In all cases, they are buried cities inside the buried city. We leave the subway now, but only briefly, because our next buried stop is also a kind of station. It is just much smaller and much stranger. Beneath the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Midtown runs a single short rail siding called Track 61. Track 61 sits inside an underground storage yard a short distance northeast of Grand Central Terminal on a private rail spur that historically connected Grand Central with the hotel. Track 61 was built in the 1920s and 1930s to give VIPs a private way to enter the hotel from the train platforms at Grand Central without needing to walk through the public lobby. It was, in essence, a presidential rail platform. There are persistent stories that Franklin Roosevelt used Track 61 to hide his disability from public view. There are persistent stories that other presidents used Track 61 for similar reasons. The platform has been the subject of repeated rumors and urban legend, and it has been the subject of repeated denials. The track itself, though, is real. It still exists. It sits in a concrete-walled cavern beneath the famous hotel. It has not hosted a paying passenger for decades, but its switch has been tested at various times. The track is a secret that is technically buried in plain sight. The Waldorf Astoria sits on top of it. The hotel serves cocktails on top of it. The hotel hosts weddings on top of it. The hotel hosts state dinners on top of it. None of its guests see the rail platform underneath. Now we go west, under the Hudson, in a sense, by going under Riverside Park. We are about to enter the Freedom Tunnel. The Freedom Tunnel is an Amtrak rail tunnel that runs from 72nd Street to roughly 124th Street under Riverside Park on the Upper West Side. The tunnel is approximately 2.5 miles long. It was originally built in the 1930s as part of Robert Moses's effort to expand park space along the Manhattan waterfront, although the construction of Moses Henry Hudson Parkway in the same area effectively blocked the public's access to the river. The tunnel was used for freight until 1980, when regular freight operations on the West Side Line ended. The railroad favored using yards in the Bronx and in New Jersey. Trucking ate freight, so the tunnel sat dark, and as it sat dark, it slowly filled with people. In the early 1980s and through the 1990s, the tunnel became the home of one of New York's most extraordinary unsanctioned communities. Homeless individuals moved into the abandoned tunnel, hooked up stolen electricity, built shantytowns inside the man-made caverns, and lived there essentially without supervision. At its peak in 1994, roughly 100 people lived in the tunnel. Some sources estimate the number fluctuated higher. The tunnel had its own internal economy, it had its own divisions of space, it had its own unspoken rules. It came to national attention through a 1993 book called The Mole People by Jennifer Toth, and through a 1995 photo book called The Tunnel by Margaret Morton, and later through a 2000 documentary called Dark Days, directed by Mark Singer. The name Mole People entered common usage for the tunnel's residents, but the tunnel was not famous only for its residents. As the residents lived, the walls filled with graffiti, brilliant, ambitious, large-scale graffiti. The reason was that the tunnel was inaccessible to police, dark, drafty, and lit only by shafts of light that fell through drainage grates in the park above, grates that turned the tunnel into a kind of underground cathedral, with each grate creating a column of soft daylight onto the floor below. Graffiti artists, working in the 1980s and 1990s, centered their murals under these grates, exactly as though they were hanging work in a gallery. The artists included the duo Sane Smith, Ghost, Twist, Dan Plasma, Cost, and Revs. Taggers respected the work of a single artist more than any other, a graffiti writer named Chris Freedom Pape, after whom the tunnel is now named. Freedom's murals included a recreation of Goya's The 3rd of May, 1808, rendered in spray paint on a curved tunnel wall, and a long comic book narrative that referenced the relationship between the former residents, the city government, and the police. Other pieces referenced the Venus de Milo, Michelangelo, Norman Rockwell. The tunnel became, for a few decades, one of the great unsanctioned museums of the world. On April 4, 1991, the tunnel was reopened for Amtrak's Empire Connection, which began running passenger trains from Penn Station up the Hudson Valley for the first time. The reopening required a massive eviction. The shantytowns were bulldozed. Many of the homeless residents were forced out under police escort. The tunnel was chained off. Graffiti artists continued to access it sporadically for years afterward, and Amtrak police occasionally escorted them out. In late 2009, Amtrak began aggressively painting over the murals in the southern half of the tunnel. The centerpiece mural honoring the tunnel's former residents disappeared. The Goya replica suffered water damage in 2010. The murals north of 91st Street were, for reasons still not entirely clear, left alone, and they survive to this day beneath Riverside Park. So now, when you walk along Riverside Park above the tunnel, light falls through the grates, falls onto the murals, falls onto the empty platform where freight trains used to run. The park does not show you the murals. The park does not tell you about the residents. The park simply walks on top of them. The buried wonder of the Freedom Tunnel is not the engineering. The buried wonder is the convergence. Freight history, housing crisis, art history, transportation history, all of it layered in the same sealed space. The tunnel is an unintentional archive of late 20th century New York. You can walk over any section of the Upper West Side and stand above all of that without seeing any of it. We are still not done. Beneath New York's hotels, beneath its parks, beneath its stations, there is another, more silent kind of burial. The slow, deliberate burial that the city performs every day in order to hold itself up. When the Woolworth Building went up, between 1911 and 1910, the engineers ran into the specific geology of Lower Manhattan. The site sat on a characteristic deep bed of quicksand. To reach solid Manhattan schist, crews had to drive caissons down through hundreds of feet of loose material, through sand, through clay, through the kinds of fill that make Lower Manhattan such a complicated place to dig in. The Woolworth Building's footprint is the footprint of a deep cylinder system sunk into the soft ground, with each cylinder reaching the schist below. That is the technique the modern skyline uses, including the deepest of New York's deep foundations. The city's tallest buildings are not really standing on the surface. They are standing on caissons that pass through fill, through marsh, through buried ponds, through buried streams, through buried cemeteries, through every layer of the city's history until they reach the half-billion-year-old rock. And the deeper you dig today in Midtown Manhattan, the more you encounter. In recent years, construction at various sites in Manhattan has uncovered additional fragments of the Croton Aqueduct system, additional wooden water pipes from the early 19th century, additional ship hulls, additional wharves. The city is constantly rediscovering itself by accident because building in New York means digging, and digging in New York means looking at the past from above. Some of these rediscovery moments are small. A wooden water pipe pulled up beside a new skyscraper, a ship's timber unexpectedly showing up in a foundation excavation for a luxury tower. Some are large. In 2005, workers excavating for the new South Ferry subway station uncovered the 18th century battery wall, the massive stone seawall that once protected the southern tip of Manhattan. They left it visible inside the station. It is now a public monument and an everyday entrance and exit for thousands of commuters who pass an old seawall on the way to the train without realizing what they are looking at. The buried city is not over. The burial is continuing. Every new development in New York is a small additional burial. Every old building demolished is a small additional erasure. The city above us is, in a sense, the most recent in a stack of cities that began thousands of years before anyone knew there would be a city. Which is why tonight, in this soft, slow journey, the city we have been describing is not really a place. It is a process, a layered process. The bedrock is the floor. The ice was the original sculptor. The buried water is still moving. The buried neighborhoods are still sitting quietly underfoot. The buried stations are still standing in the dark. The buried tunnel under Atlantic Avenue is still waiting to be reopened. The buried pneumatic experiment under Broadway is still sealed. The buried burial grounds are still graves. The buried groaning chalk of the Freedom Tunnel is still bringing sunlight down through grates onto murals that paint Goya in the dark. The buried platform of Track 61 is still under the Waldorf Astoria. The buried park memories of Seneca Village are still a few feet under the Great Lawn. The buried sea that once covered this whole continent is the geological ground on which every layer you have just heard about was laid. New York is not a city on a rock. New York is a city on water, on ice, on fill, on bones, on catacombs, on its own forgotten selves. Beneath the streets, there is no single stable ground. There is just the most recent layer. There is just what the city was, briefly, before this city arrived and buried it. And now, sleep tonight. If you live in New York, you can walk outside and stand above any of these places. Stand above the Great Lawn. Stand above Washington Square, stand above Atlantic Avenue, stand above Riverside Park, stand above the Waldorf, stand above the subway, stand on any sidewalk just before going home. Look down for one moment. The ground is not what it seems. The ground is full. The ground is layered. The ground is older than you. The ground remembers everything the surface forgot. And that, slowly, is enough that sleep follows. There is more to read in the deep stratigraphy, and we are only partway down. Consider the bedrock itself. Manhattan schist is not some abstract geological fact. It is a real kind of rock, formed under heat and pressure, roughly 450 million years ago, when the ancient Iapetus Ocean was closing and the land that would become North America was colliding with a chain of volcanic islands. That collision folded the seafloor upward into the tough, shiny, layered mica schist that gives Midtown Manhattan its load-bearing spine. It is a rock so dense that skyscrapers built above it could rise higher than anywhere else in the world during the early 20th century, because the architects knew the rock would hold them. The same rock tells a quieter story too, because the schist is also folded and fractured. It shifts, it cracks, it leaks, it releases radon. It carries small amounts of groundwater through its joints. It is not static. The bedrock itself is still moving in tiny, imperceptible ways. The bedrock is the reason Manhattan can stand, and the bedrock is the reason Manhattan will not stand forever. The formations that the schist sits with are also old and also interesting. The Fordham gneiss, an even older rock than the schist, appears in parts of the Bronx and at the surface in Upper Manhattan. The Inwood marble, a band of metamorphosed limestone, runs through northern Manhattan. The Manhattan schist and the Inwood marble together create the steep ridges that shape Washington Heights and Inwood. Many early settlers built along those ridges because the rock outcropped and the soil was thin and dry, which was easier to farm. That is one of the buried reasons it took New York so long to develop on the Lower East Side. The Lower East Side sat on flat, wet, marshy ground near the East River, and the rocks did not help. Once the city understood that bedrock held the skyline, it stopped trying to develop the wetland and started filling the wetland instead. Which is why much of Lower Manhattan is fill on a swamp on top of a tidal creek, with the schist sometimes more than 250 feet below. Above the bedrock, above the schist, sits a layer of glacial till, dumped at the end of the Ice Age as the Wisconsin ice sheet slowly melted in place. Till is unsorted. It is a mixture of clay, sand, gravel, and boulders. It is what you get when a glacier drops its load. Beneath most of Upper Manhattan there is till. Beneath Lower Manhattan, there is mostly fill over soft clay, which is far less reliable, which is exactly why the engineers of the Woolworth building had to drive caissons all the way down to rock. The buried ground of New York gets worse the further south and east you go. Below 14th Street, you are rarely sitting on anything you could call good ground. Above 96th Street, the rock is often within a few feet of the sidewalk. In between the bedrock and the modern pavement lies the buried coastline, the buried fresh water, the buried sea levels, and the buried ice of New York 10,000 years ago, after the ice finally retreated. But before the ocean had finished rebounding from the weight of the lost ice, the shoreline of New York Harbor was not where it is now. The ocean reached further inland. The East River was wider. The Hudson was wider. Manhattan was an island with much more marshland around it. The salt marshes that dominated what is now Long Island City and Greenpoint were enormous. The Gowanus Creek, the natural outflow of which became the Gowanus Canal, was a long tidal estuary winding through what is now central Brooklyn. Today, the Gowanus Canal is one of the most polluted waterways in the United States, a Superfund site lined with warehouses. But the buried creek it replaced is still sitting underneath the canal, still pushing small amounts of water through the silt, still tidal, although the tides are tightly controlled now by mechanical gates. Newtown Creek, on the Brooklyn-Queens border, is similar. Newtown Creek was once the most heavily industrialized waterway in the country, lined with oil refineries, slaughterhouses, and petrochemical plants, and it was slowly filled, diked, and absorbed into the city's bulkheads, so that today only a small portion of its original length is openly visible. The buried creek is still flowing beneath Greenpoint and Williamsburg, and it carries the groundwater that residents of the neighborhood tap into their basements. After the oil spill beneath Greenpoint, the buried creek was discovered to be carrying roughly 17 million gallons of refined petroleum products somewhere in the buried network, reaching all the way to the Manhattan schist. The buried creek of Newtown is not just a hydrological history. It is an active, ongoing, contaminant-carrying artery. The buried shellfish is older still. Before the Dutch arrived in 1609, the island of Manhattan was used for thousands of years by the Lenape, who built their summer fishing camps along its shores and discarded the shells of oysters, clams, and scallops in enormous mounds. These shell middens were especially large near the southern tip of Manhattan, near what is now the Battery, and along the East River, near what is now the Lower East Side. When the Dutch began to level Manhattan's terrain in the 17th century, they sometimes used the shell middens as raw material for mortar, roadbed, and fill. The buried shells are still there, packed into the foundations of colonial houses, packed into the ballast of early roads, packed into the loose soils of the Lower East Side. They are one of the reasons certain lower Manhattan blocks smell faintly of brine when it rains. The buried shells are not a metaphor. They are calcium carbonate in the ground, still reacting with rainwater, still releasing the faint marine smell of the pre-colonial harbor. And the Lenape themselves are buried under the city. Not as myth, not as metaphor, but as a real, ongoing archaeological discovery. In 2021, human remains, possibly connected to the indigenous occupation of the island, were unexpectedly uncovered during construction work in the financial district. The discovery was small, in public framing, but it changed the construction schedule. The buried city is not just European in its burials. The buried city is also indigenous. The colonial era added its own layers of burial on top of the Lenape middens. Much of early New Amsterdam was marsh and dock. Land was filled outward into the rivers. Ships, sometimes entire ships, were scuttled deliberately along the shoreline to provide a foundation for new docks. Some of those ships are now buried under city streets. A famous buried ship, the Ronson ship, was discovered in 1982 during construction at 290 Broadway, the same site that would, 9 years later, reveal the African burial ground. The Ronson ship was a mid-18th century cargo vessel, scuttled or abandoned in what had been the East River, then buried under landfill, then ignored for 2 centuries. Its keel survived. Its frame survived. When workers at 290 Broadway realized what they had hit, archaeologists excavated the ship in situ, photographed it, and then, in one of the more poetic episodes of New York's buried history, the ship was reburied in place beneath the federal office building that was being constructed above it. The ship is sitting under the office workers. The building was built on the burial site of a buried ship. The New York City subway system was built in much the same way as the colonial docks, by deliberately burying things. The system was constructed between 1900 and 1940 almost entirely by hand, in tunnels driven through sand, clay, schist, and salt water by a class of workers known as sandhogs. The sandhogs worked in compressed air, because most of the underwater tunnel sections could only be cut by increasing the pressure inside the tunnel to keep the water out. Many of them got the bends. Many of them died. Many of them also did something that we will come back to. They buried tunnels deliberately, filled in stations, abandoned platforms, used old infrastructure as fill for new infrastructure. The sandhogs literally buried pieces of the city as part of their jobs. One of the most famous sandhog projects was the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge caissons in 1870 and 1871. To build the foundations of the Brooklyn Bridge, crews sunk enormous wooden caissons, in essence giant upside-down boxes, into the East River, and dug them deeper and deeper by hand, removing the silt beneath them and letting them slowly settle to bedrock. The caissons themselves were the size of city blocks. Workers descended into them through shafts. They worked in the dark, in pressurized air, in cold water seeping through the joints of the timbers. Many got the bends, which they called caisson disease. Some never came back up. Their bodies are buried, in a sense, in the foundations of the bridge. Washington Roebling, the chief engineer, did not descend into the caissons in person, but his wife Emily did, repeatedly, and she survived, and the bridge was finished. The sandhogs also helped build most of New York's other bridges. The Williamsburg Bridge opened in 1903. The Manhattan Bridge opened in 1909. The Queensboro Bridge opened in 1909. The Hellgate Bridge opened in 1916. The George Washington Bridge opened in 1931. Every one of those bridges has buried foundations, and every one of those buried foundations is the resting place of men who died building them. The bridges are not just above the river. They are buried into the river. Their buried parts are the parts that hold them up. The subway system that the sandhogs then went on to build has its own buried tragedies. The 1929 IRT 6th Avenue explosion, in which a spark ignited a leaking gas main near 14th Street, killed more than a dozen workers and injured many more, and people who lived through it described feeling the shock as far away as Brooklyn. The 1905 electrocution of a work crew at the IRT subway near Park Place killed 10 men in a single accident, and the city banned high-voltage construction of that kind for decades afterward. Whenever we describe the buried subway as a technical marvel, as a triumph of engineering, we should also remember that the engineering was, in part, paid for by bodies buried in the tunnel walls, But the buried city is not only deaths. The buried city is also entire neighborhoods that remain visible from above but invisible from the surface. Lower Manhattan is one of the most archaeologically sensitive urban landscapes in North America, which is why the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission has, for decades, flagged every site excavation in Lower Manhattan for review. When crews dig, even for utility trenches, they flag archaeologists. The buried city is still being unburied, slowly, one trench at a time. Each trench gives up a tiny message. Each trench reveals a wooden water pipe, a brick culvert, a foundation corner, a piece of iron, a bone. The buried city whispers back when you ask. We should also talk about the buried kennels, the buried stables, the buried firehouses, the buried churches of New York, because the city is not just buried water and buried transit. It is also buried animal life. In the 19th century, the city kept draft horses by the tens of thousands. They had stables. They had stables beneath buildings. They had stables built into the basements of corner lots. Some of those stables still exist as sealed spaces beneath apartment buildings in the East Village and the Lower East Side. They have haylofts, they have iron rings for tying, they have sloped floors for drainage. They were sealed up around the early 20th century when the automobile replaced the horse, and they were never reopened. They became basements, they became cellars, they became storage space, they became forgotten. In the same era, the city kept its fire equipment in engine houses, several of which were eventually covered over as part of larger construction projects, including the famous former quarters of Engine Company 31 near the Bowery, whose facade still stands but whose interior horse stalls and equipment bays are now hidden under later buildings. The buried firehouses are not the most famous buried things, but they are real. The buried utilities are more obvious. Sewers, water lines, gas lines, steam lines. Con Edison maintains a vast underground network of steam pipes beneath Midtown Manhattan, distributing steam to commercial buildings for heating and hot water in tunnels that have been in continuous use since 1882. The buried steam system is the largest in the world. It is the reason winter Midtown smells faintly of sulfur when the grates open. Beneath you, day and night, hot pressurized steam is moving in great arched tunnels, sometimes more than 10 feet in diameter, lined with brick, traveling at speeds fast enough to start your hair. The buried steam is the city's hidden circulatory system. Below the steam, below the sewer, below the subway, below the aqueduct, below the buried stables, below the buried shell middens, below the buried ships, below the buried Lenape camps, below the buried creeks, below the buried ponds, below the buried fill, below the buried glacial till, all the way at the bottom, sits the schist. The schist is roughly 450 million years old. It was once ocean floor. It was once a mountain. It was once the bottom of a deep trench. It has been folded, lifted, and tilted. It is shiny, it is hard, it is dense, it holds the city up, and here is the strangest buried thing of all. The schist is also a working aquifer. Throughout Manhattan, the schist leaks groundwater slowly through its joints. The groundwater of Manhattan is a real hydrologically mapped system. It is not the famous Catskill aquifer that supplies New York drinking water. It is a different system entirely. A shallow, schist-borne, urban aquifer that wells up at certain points along the East River and along the Hudson. The buried groundwater of Manhattan is real. It flows. It moves under the surface every day, mostly unmonitored, mostly unmapped by anyone except hydrogeologists. The buried water table remembers all the buried streams and buried ponds. If we put a sensor in the ground at Washington Square, we would still detect a small rise and fall with each tide. The old pond is not gone. The underground pond is rising and falling elsewhere in the watershed, and so the city we are listening to tonight sits not on a solid piece of ground, but on a slow, layered system of buried water, buried memory, buried bones, and buried stone. Seep follows the story, gently. The buried world is not going anywhere, but you can leave it now, the way an explorer leaves a deep well. Climb back up. Let the surface reassert itself. Let the apartment you are in be the upper layer again. Let the soft weight of sleep gather over your bones, the way the buried world gathers over the cities. You do not have to keep digging. You can simply be the most recent layer for a few hours, sleeps, then, among the buried layers of a city that has never been finished. Sleep on top of forgotten cemeteries, forgotten creeks, forgotten catacombs, forgotten subway platforms, forgotten tunnels, and forgotten ice. Sleep over Manhattan schist that once was ocean floor and will one day be ocean floor again. Because everything that is buried is also waiting to be unburied, and the city above your window is just the most recent attempt to keep the older layers down. The buried world is patient. It will wait. The buried creek still flows. The buried tunnel still waits. The buried piano still sits in the dark beneath Broadway. The buried chandeliers still hang at City Hall. The buried neighborhood of Seneca Village still rests under the Great Lawn. The buried bones of Washington Square still lie beneath the granite fountain. The buried bedrock still holds every skyscraper, and the buried water still rises and falls beneath them. And you, very lightly now, sleep above them. There is a quiet kind of geography in all of this, and it is worth naming before sleep closes the door. The buried city of New York is organized by elevation, and the elevation is not accidental. The low points are the wet points. The points where brook water still flows under the pavement, the points where the tide still pushes inland through make-believe pipes, the points where the bones lie shallower because the fill was shallower. The high points of Manhattan, by contrast, are the rocky points. They are the points where the schist outcropped first. They are the points where the oldest forest grew. They are the points where the first farms were laid out. They are the points where the old roads bent around and where, eventually, the tallest buildings rose. Walk Riverside Drive along the spine of the Upper West Side, and you are walking above the highest exposed schist on the West Side. Walk Broadway through Midtown, and you are walking almost directly above the geological spine, with caissons for every skyscraper plunging down through the loose fill into the same rock. Walk Greenwich Avenue through the village, and you are walking above the buried Minetta Brook, which still flows under your feet. Walk Atlantic Avenue through Cobble Hill, and you are walking above the oldest subway tunnel in America, sealed in 1861 and forgotten until 1980. Walk Riverside Park from 72nd to 124th Street, and you are walking above the Freedom Tunnel, above Goya Aza murals, above the Mole People, above the catacomb of late 20th century New York. Every landscape has its own way of being buried. New York's way is to keep building on top of what it buried and then to bury the next thing on top. That is what we have been listening to tonight. The city is not a place, it is an act of layering. And the layering is the city. It might help, gently, at this point in the story, to walk back through the layers one more time, very slowly, almost like a lullaby, because the pattern of buried things is, when you draw it out, almost musical. The first layer is bone. The Lenape shell middens, before anyone called the place New York, gave the future ground a carbonate memory. Every later garden, every later park, every later sidewalk, every later skyscraper foundation rests on that bone. The second layer is harbor, the buried shoreline, the buried salt marsh, the buried fill, hand-piled barge by hand-piled barge, extending the island outward into the rivers, year after year, for 3 centuries. The third layer is fresh water, the buried ponds, the buried brooks, Minetta, Tibbets, Collect, the buried drinking water that the city kept drinking even after the city had already buried its source. The fourth layer is the colonial street, the buried houses of New Amsterdam, the buried wharves, the buried ships, the buried shell-lime mortar, the buried dock timbers. The fifth layer is the cemetery, the buried graveyards of Trinity, of the African burial ground, of the Zion Church, of the Potter's Field at Washington Square, of the unmarked cemetery plots that no one mapped at all. The sixth layer is the aqueduct, the buried Croton, with its slow masonry channels running under sidewalks, distributing gravity-fed water into the city. The seventh layer is the neighborhood, the buried Seneca Village. The buried Five Points, slowly settling into the buried pond. The buried immigrant tenements of Kleindeutschland. The buried black settlement of Sandy Ground on Staten Island. Each is a city removed in order to build the next city. The eighth layer is the transit. The buried pneumatic, the buried Cobble Hill Tunnel, the buried subway platforms, the buried siding beneath the Waldorf, the buried rivers of cable and conduit running through the city. The ninth layer is the people, the buried sandhogs in the caissons and the tunnel walls, the buried bones of the buried epidemics, the buried bodies of the buried potter's fields. The 10th layer is the giant infrastructure, the buried steam, the buried sewer, the buried power, the buried cable. The 11th layer is the ice and the schist beneath everything. The buried ocean that the bedrock once was, the buried glaciers that bulldozed the land, and the 12th layer is the most recent city. The layer you are sitting inside right now, the apartment, the building, the street outside, this is just the latest skin. It will be buried too, one day. Something newer will rise above it, and the present will become the buried layer for the next generation. That is how to imagine a city. 12 deep breaths, 12 layers, each one carrying everything below it, each one having been, at some point, the only surface in the world. The buried city is not a metaphor. The buried city is a measurement. It is the vertical distance between where you are lying down tonight and where the schist begins. It is also the temporal distance between when this neighborhood was a Lenape fishing camp and when it became a luxury high-rise. The buried city is a stack of time. We have been, tonight, walking down through that stack, one layer at a time, as gently as we could. Now gently the story narrows. It narrows towards sleep. Imagine you are descending a very slow staircase. There is no railing, but there does not need to be. You have been doing this for a long time. Each step takes you down through another buried thing. The buried step is shallow. The buried step is wide. The buried step does not creak. Another step. Another buried thing. A buried cistern, a buried well shaft, a buried trolley cable, a buried gas main. You do not have to be afraid of any of these. They are not dangerous. They are old. They are still. They are patient. They are waiting for some future night when a child digging in a backyard, or a crew excavating a foundation, or a hydrologist checking a sensor will once again bring them to the surface. The buried city is patient. It can wait. You do not need to remember the dates. They will be there tomorrow. The buried city is not a test. It is a thing you can come back to later in smaller chimes. There will be more slow stories. There will be a slow story about the buried railroads of Grand Central, lying below the active platforms, the abandoned Track 61 corridor, the lost mail platforms, the lost barbershop under the Waldorf. There will be a slow story about the buried telephone exchanges, with their 1,000 hands of operators reaching through brick for phantom callers. There will be a slow story about the buried municipal swimming pools, the lost bathhouses, the lost gymnasia, the buried cold storage vaults that once lay under the meatpacking district. There will be a slow story about the buried river pirate wrecks off the Battery. There will be a slow story about the buried ballast of the world's longest seawall. Tonight is only one of those stories. Tonight is only about one buried city. Tonight we have walked down through it gently, slowly, layer by layer, until even the rock itself became quiet. Tonight, sleep, in the soft knowledge that wherever you are, the ground beneath you is older than you think, and that underneath the older ground, there is older ground, and underneath that, older ground still, somewhere underneath, the schist still holds. Somewhere underneath, the water still moves. Somewhere underneath, the bones still lie. You are resting, of course, on top of all of them. There is one more sound we should listen to before we close our eyes, and it is the sound of the city, very deep beneath its own surfaces, still doing work, even now, even with the buried cemeteries sealed and the buried tunnels sealed and the buried pneumatic experiments sealed, the city underneath is not silent. There is movement, there is plumbing, there is the slow, mechanical heartbeat of buried infrastructure that never stops. There are, beneath Manhattan's surface, approximately 140,000 miles of wiring, much of it older than the iPhone generation. There are 6,000 miles of gas main, some of it cast iron laid in the 1880s, some of it newer, all of it aging. There are buried telephone lines that connect, through hardwired copper, to buildings whose residents have not placed a landline call in 15 years. There are buried fiber optic lines laid in the last 20 years that carry more information in a single hour than the entire telegraph traffic of 1900. There are buried steam pipes, more than 100 miles of them, distributing superheated pressurized water vapor through brick-lined trunks beneath Midtown. There are buried drainage trunks carrying stormwater to outfalls. There are buried Department of Sanitation salt piles. There are buried nitrogen injections. There are buried chilled water pipes for cooling Midtown's data centers. There are buried pneumatic tubes for sending documents between banks, a system that still functions in some places, although less so every year. That infrastructure is not historic. That infrastructure is not a museum. That infrastructure is alive. It hums. It leaks, it loses pressure somewhere. It needs repair somewhere. It is constantly being worked on, sometimes by day, more often at night, by crews who go into the buried New York after the surface New York has gone home. The night crews are not a small special case. The night crews are a sizable portion of the city's working population. They work beneath you while you sleep. What they work on, often, is the second burial of something that they are replacing. They dig up an old pipe, they cut it out. They send the section, often still dripping, up out of the trench. They lower a new section down in its place. They rebury it, they pave over the trench. They file a paper noting that the buried thing has been exchanged, and they move on to the next buried section, a few blocks away, deeper, older, sharper edged in some other system. The buried city is constantly being replaced in place. The buried infrastructure does not really come back to the surface. The buried infrastructure simply becomes a slightly newer buried infrastructure. That is why we call them sandhogs. And that is why we continue to call them sandhogs even now, because the buried city is still their workplace. The sandhogs are still adding layers. We mentioned earlier that New York's buried story is, in part, a story about bodies. It is worth, gently, returning to that thought. The buried bodies are not just under Washington Square. The buried bodies are not just in the African burial ground. The buried bodies are scattered across lower Manhattan in small, unmapped concentrations that nobody has ever publicly cataloged. They are under construction sites. They are under roadway widenings. They are under stretches of sidewalk. Sometimes they are disarticulated, turned to powder by centuries of groundwater, mixed into the fill on which a luxury tower now rests. Sometimes they are intact, in caskets that were never disturbed because nobody ever had reason to dig that exact spot. The 20,000 bodies under Washington Square are not the only bodies in Manhattan. They are just the bodies in the largest single, still intact, identified deposit. When yellow fever hit in the 1790s and early 1800s, New York buried its victims wherever it could. Some were buried in churchyards, some in family plots, some were buried in trenches, some were buried in the Potter's Field at Washington Square, some were simply thrown into the city's creeks, into Collect Pond, into the East River. The buried city, when you arrive at that layer, is a city of bodies. It is the city's apology. Accumulated, there is a small, systematic project by the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission to map unmarked burial sites in Lower Manhattan, and the project's findings fill boxes of paper at the LPC's archive. The hidden cemetery map of Lower Manhattan is not public, but it is comprehensive. It shows, layer by layer, who is buried where. The biggest dot on the map is the African burial ground. The second biggest dot is the Trinity Churchyard. Then, smaller dots, dozens of them, scattered around what was downtown until 1822 and what was downtown again after 1840. The smaller dots are mostly forgotten. The smaller dots are mostly unmarked. The smaller dots show, on the map, exactly where the surface must not be opened lightly. When a developer wants to break ground in Lower Manhattan, the LPC reviews the proposed dig. If the proposed dig intersects a known dot on the map, archaeologists are required to monitor the dig. If bones are found, the dig stops. The dig is described publicly. The bones are sometimes reburied in place, sometimes excavated, sometimes moved to a holding facility for study. The process can take years. The buried city is still being negotiated, one trench at a time, with the dead. The buried city, however, is not macabre. The buried city is not a haunted house story. The buried city is the lived city. The buried city is the city's actual texture. The buried bones and the buried pipes are both exactly the kind of thing that makes the surface we walk on possible, and the surface we walk on is the only city most of us have ever known. The buried city means that New York has weight, both literal and figurative. New York weighs more than it looks like it should. New York's actually existing weight is not just the weight of its steel and glass and concrete. New York's actual weight includes the weight of its buried water, its buried infrastructure, its buried bodies, its buried schist, its buried memory. The full weight of New York would surprise a geologist, if you could measure it. Most of New York's mass is below the surface. The above-ground city is, in some literal sense, an excrescence on the buried city. The buried city is also the city that residents of New York sense in their bones during heavy rain. The buried city floods. The buried city overflows. The combined sewer overflows release their combined water into rivers. The buried tunnel reservoirs fill, the buried aqueducts back up, the buried water table rises. The buried world, which is generally quiet, becomes loud during rain. And the loudness is one of the ways the buried world continues to teach the surface world what is below. The buried city's most recent public lesson happened during Hurricane Sandy in 2012. The storm surge reached inland of the buried coastline, flooded the buried subway system, brought water into the buried tunnels, flooded Con Ed's buried electrical infrastructure, shut down power for days across large sections of the city. Sandy was, in a real sense, the buried city reaching up to the surface. The buried water rose. The buried tunnels were, for a few days, surface water. The buried infrastructure broke. The buried city was, briefly, the visible city. If we wanted to map the buried New York, we would need a layered map. The most common kind of buried city map shows utilities. New York's utility maps are surprisingly public. The Department of Environmental Protection publishes water main maps. Con Ed publishes electric conduit maps. The Department of Transportation publishes sewer maps. The MTA publishes subway maps, including, in dense form, the buried abandoned platforms. None of those maps, however, is unified. They are not stacked into a single readable atlas. They are not arranged by depth. They are not arranged by date of burial. The buried city needs a different atlas than the one most people imagine, an atlas in which the x-axis is easting, the y-axis is northing, and the z-axis is depth and time. The buried atlas of New York, when you draw it, would look like a layered cake. Above, the asphalt and the granite and the brick. Just below that, the public utility layer, the buried sewer, the buried gas, the buried water. Then, a slightly deeper layer, the buried subway. Then, the buried aqueduct. Then the buried sandstone of the colonial utilities, then the buried wharves and the buried ships and the buried shell middens, then the buried creeks and the buried ponds, then the buried cemeteries, then the buried bone of the Lenape middens, then the buried till of the glaciation, then the buried surface of the bedrock. The buried atlas is 12 stories deep. It has a top floor and a basement, and the basement is older than everything else combined. If you take a vertical slice of the buried city of New York, you are essentially taking a slice through a palimpsest. A palimpsest is a manuscript whose original writing has been scraped off so the parchment can be written on again. The buried city is a palimpsest on a city scale. The original surface was the Lenape ground. That has been overwritten by the Dutch grid. That has been overwritten by the British crown streets. That has been overwritten by the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, which imposed the Manhattan grid on almost all of the island above Houston Street. That has been overwritten by the canyons of Broadway and 6th Avenue. That has been overwritten by the Skidmore-shaped towers of Midtown. Each new writing is a layer. The buried city contains every previous writing. The buried city is, in addition, slowly writing the next layer underneath what we have now. What we live on will be the surface of the buried city for the next millennium, and the buried city will have one more floor. The buried city is therefore also a future city. The buried city is what the next millennium will see if it digs down. The buried New York of 1825, the buried New York of 1844, the buried New York of 1870, the buried New York of 1904, the buried New York of 1945, the buried New York of 1980. All of these are future fossils waiting to be excavated. If any future city continues to find it interesting to dig down, the cycle of burial and unburial in New York is not a story of progress. It is a story of layering. There is no improvement. There is only depth. The buried New York of 1785 is not worse than the buried New York of 1885. They are both buried. They are both waiting. They are both part of the same stack. The buried city also makes a kind of argument about memory. Whose memories are preserved above ground, and whose memories are buried? The Dutch street names are preserved, somewhat. The Lenape place names have been almost entirely erased, except for a handful of terms that have been quietly retained, like Mosholu and Spootenduyvil and the Harlem River's older name. The African burial ground was buried twice, once officially in 1794 when it was closed, and again effectively when the city grew over it. The African burial ground was unburied slowly after 1991. Its unburial is not over. Seneca Village was buried once in 1857 when the village was razed. Its unburial is still underway. The archaeological work at Seneca Village has been going on for years, and it is expected to continue for years more, because the city has not yet committed to a full public memorial of the village. Mer is buried in this city. Memory is unburied in this city. The patterns of burial reflect the patterns of who mattered in any given century and who could afford to remain visible. The buried history of New York is, in a quiet way, the buried memory of New York's poor. We can think of the buried city, then, in three intertwined ways. We can think of it as geology, the layer of ice and schist and clay and fill, which is older than anybody. We can think of it as engineered infrastructure, the layer of pipes and tunnels and platforms, which is roughly as old as the city itself. We can think of it as memory, the layer of cemeteries and buried neighborhoods and buried creeks, which is the part of the buried city most directly connected to people. The three layers are not separate. They curl into each other. The buried concrete over a buried cemetery sits on a buried neighborhood that itself sits on a buried pond that itself sits on a buried creek. The buried city is, in other words, a single layered place in which geology, infrastructure, and memory have been deliberately stacked for centuries. The buried city is a single slow thing. The buried city is one place. Tonight we have been exploring it. We are, slowly, heading toward the end of our descent because it is time to rest. The next story, if you return, is about a different buried city. Tonight we are in New York. We could keep going. We have not talked about the buried streetcar system. We have not talked about the lost L structures dismantled after the Second World War. We have not talked about the buried pneumatic post office. We have not talked about the buried Cold War civil defense tunnels. We have not talked about the buried ammunition magazines under Fort Totten. We have not talked about the buried mail tunnels under Grand Central. There is more, and there will be more later in another story. For now, we are resting on the 12th layer. We have walked all the way down. We have walked all the way down, and we have come back up. The surface is soft under us, and we are grateful. Let us slow the breathing now. Let us listen to the buried city briefly, one more time, and then let us sleep. What you are hearing right now is the city beneath you, not as noise, as memory. The buried city does not actually make much sound. The buried city sometimes creaks, the buried pipes sometimes hiss, the buried foundations sometimes settle a 16th of an inch. The buried neighborhood of 100 people sometimes feels, to a sensitive listener, like a hand resting on the sole of the foot. The buried city is not loud. The buried city is patient. The buried city is the longest prayer in the world, and it is finished, and we are now resting where the prayer is worn smoothest life, then on top of the burial. Sleep well on top of all of it. The buried city keeps its promises. The buried city will not let you fall through. The buried city is also a city of forgotten infrastructure projects that almost were and never became, and that linger as unbuilt ghosts below the surface. Consider the projected but unfinished Lower Manhattan Expressway. Take the projected but unfinished Cross-Brooklyn Expressway. Take the projected but unfinished underground freight tunnel that has been proposed, in one form or another, since 1925 and never completed, sometimes called the Cross Harbor Rail Tunnel, an idea for sending freight rail directly from New Jersey to Brooklyn beneath New York Harbor. The buried tunnel does not exist, but the buried plan for it does. The buried plan lives on shelves. The buried plan lives in environmental reports. The buried plan is a layer in its own right, the layer of urban dreams that the city buried through inaction, incomplete burial, the burial of ambition. Consider, on the other hand, the buried infrastructure that does exist, but that the city has chosen, for the moment, to stop using. The High Line is the surface trace of what had been a freight rail line. The freight rail line ran from 34th Street up the west side, mostly at grade, eventually becoming an elevated structure after 1934. The line carried freight trains through the west side until 1980, when the last freight train ran. The line then sat abandoned for more than a decade. It then became, famously, a public park, opened in sections between 2009 and 2014, the High Line Elevated Park. But underneath the High Line, beneath the elevated structure's columns, lie buried foundations that go deep into the Manhattan schist, and that had been driven more than half a century earlier for a freight rail system that ran on the surface. The columns of the High Line are themselves surface remnants of older buried infrastructure the buried concrete piers of the West Side Improvement. The Highline Park is, structurally, the decapitated top of a much longer buried system that once connected directly to the freight terminals along the Hudson. And then there is Pennsylvania Station, which is itself a burial of sorts. The original Penn Station, opened in 1910, was one of the great architectural works of the 20th century, modeled after the baths of Caracalla, with a vast arched glass train shed and elaborate public rooms. The original Penn Station was demolished in 1963 to make way for Madison Square Garden, and the demolition was a defining event in the birth of the modern historic preservation movement. But what is less remembered is that beneath the original Penn Station, beneath the current Penn Station, beneath Madison Square Garden, the rail tunnels themselves remain hidden. They were always hidden. The original Penn Station sat on top of tunnel mouths that ran east to Long Island and west to New Jersey. The current Penn Station sits on the same tunnel mouths. The hidden tunnels are still active. The hidden tunnels were built between 1904 and 1910 by the Pennsylvania Railroad under the direction of Charles M. Jacobs, using cut and cover between 31st and 33rd Streets and tunnel boring methods elsewhere. East River Tubes 1 and 2, the two tunnel pairs for the Long Island Railroad, run under the East River from Penn Station to the LIRR terminal at Hunters Point in Queens. These tunnels are still in continuous use. These tunnels are buried under the East River, 100 feet down at their lowest point, in cast iron rings bolted together under high pressure. The East River passes over them. The East River is quietly sitting on Penn Station. The current Penn Station, in fact, is itself becoming a buried thing. The Moynihan Train Hall, opened in 2021, replaced part of the Farley Post Office building across 8th Avenue as a new entry to the LIRR and Amtrak concourses beneath the post office's main hall. The Moynihan Train Hall is one of the more spectacular buried architecture projects in recent New York memory, since the original post office building had been built with the disused amphitheater of the old Penn Station at its heart, in some sense re-blueprinting the public room that had been demolished almost 60 years earlier. The hidden room of the old Penn Station has been quietly reworked into the new Penn Station. The hidden room of the old Penn Station is, in a sense, exhumed. There is also the East Side Access Project, completed in 2023, which extended the LIRR into a new concourse beneath Grand Central Terminal, in tunnels running from Queens into Manhattan. The East Side Access Project is roughly the largest single infrastructure project in New York since the original subway was built. It is buried. The new LIR concourse sits approximately 15 stories below Grand Central. Its platforms sit more than 100 feet below street level. The cavern for the new terminal is roughly the size of the Great Hall of Grand Central above it. The cavern has its own arches, its own ceilings, its own masonry. The cavern is also, in a quieter way, a buried copy of Grand Central. The buried terminal reflects the buried terminal. Underground Grand Central is the buried echo of above-ground Grand Central. The subterranean infrastructure of New York is constantly expanding. While you have been listening tonight, crews somewhere beneath the city have been digging. There is, beneath New York, an active construction site that never closes. Sandhogs continue to add new caissons beneath Manhattan for residential towers. Tunneling machines continue to chew steadily through clay and schist for new sewer outfalls. There is, beneath Brooklyn, an active expansion of the storm sewer system, partly built in response to lessons from Sandy. There is, beneath the Bronx, an active program of daylighting Tibbetts Brook, which is to say, removing sections of 19th century buried sewer pipe from above the buried brook and exposing the brook to the sky once again. There is, beneath Queens, an active program of mapping the buried creeks that the engineers of the 1910s piped underground with the explicit intent of opening some of them back up, although the regrades and the development above them make that work extraordinarily difficult. The buried city, in other words, is not a museum. The buried city is active. The buried city is being constantly modified, expanded, repaired. The buried city is something the city does every night. The buried city is not finished. The buried city will not be finished in our lifetimes, and it will not be finished in the lifetimes of our grandchildren. Among them, the Second Avenue subway. The Second Avenue subway is the most famous unfinished infrastructure project in New York. It was first proposed in 1919. It was partially built in the 1970s, with several miles of tunnel already dug, only to be abandoned because of the city's fiscal crisis. The pre-built tunnels sat empty for decades. They filled with groundwater. They were considered a kind of civic embarrassment, the visible face of the unfinished subway. The Phase 1 of the Second Avenue subway opened in 2017. Phase 2 is under construction now. Phase 3 and Phase 4 are unfunded. The buried Second Avenue subway tunnels are part of the buried city. The buried Second Avenue subway tunnels were simply left where they had been. They were a part of the buried city, incomplete. They waited. Then, decades later, some of them were incorporated into the new Phase 1. New York is good at burying its unfinished things. New York has a recurring habit of planning transit projects, partly building them, then abandoning them, then incorporating the partly built sections decades later. The buried transit plan becomes a future project. The buried transit plan sits in the ground, waiting. Consider the never-built but partially dug 63rd Street Tunnel, which was originally planned in the 1960s and is now used by the F train as a turnback loop. Take the partially built 6 extension to the Bronx, which was dug in the 1970s and then abandoned. The partially dug tunnels are all over New York, sealed dark but real. They are the buried future of the subway. They are the buried futures of the city. Many of those buried futures were buried because of the fiscal crisis of 1975, when the city's bond rating collapsed, when President Ford refused to extend credit, when the daily newspapers were full of the phrase "Ford to city, drop dead." The fiscal crisis of 1975 ended a generation of transit building. The fiscal crisis of 1975 left partly built tunnels under Second Avenue, under the East River, in the Bronx. The fiscal crisis of 1975 left partially built housing projects. The fiscal crisis of 1975 left partially built sewer projects. The fiscal crisis of 1975's projects are buried all over the city. They are part of the buried layer of abandoned civic ambition. Among the buried projects of 1975 is the buried Lower Manhattan Expressway, which had been Robert Moses' plan for a 10-lane highway through Soho, Little Italy, and Chinatown, connecting the Manhattan Bridge to the Holland Tunnel. The buried Lower Manhattan Expressway would have wiped out hundreds of city blocks. The buried Lower Manhattan Expressway was stopped by community protest in the late 1960s, and the existing right-of-way was repurposed. But the buried infrastructure footprint of the proposed Lower Manhattan Expressway is still partly visible. There are, beneath the surface, sections of elevated approach that were partially built. There are buried caissons for the proposed expressway. There are buried foundations. The buried expressway is part of the buried city. Robert Moses himself is the buried figure most responsible for the shape of modern New York's underground. Moses built bridges and highways and parks, and he built them by burying and unburying the city at speed. Moses widened city streets by filling in the buried streams. Moses destroyed neighborhoods to build highways. Moses built the Henry Hudson Bridge by burying segments of Inwood marble. Moses built the Triborough Bridge by burying a substantial portion of the Bronx shoreline. Moses built the Belt Parkway by burying neighborhoods on the Brooklyn waterfront. Moses also built, as we noted, the Freedom Tunnel, the tunnel beneath Riverside Park. Moses's buried legacy is the literal buried footprint of mid-20th century New York. The buried Robert Moses is the buried architect of the modern buried city. Moses was also, paradoxically, the man who stopped most of New York's other buried projects from coming into being. Moses opposed the buried freight rail tunnel under New York Harbor. Moses opposed the buried water tunnel number 3 for years, until his political power was broken. Moses opposed the buried transmission cable under the Verrazano Narrows. Moses preferred, almost always, to build above ground. The buried infrastructure Moses wanted to avoid is the buried infrastructure the city has had to build after him. Then there is, for example, City Water Tunnel number 3. City Water Tunnel number 3 is the largest capital project in New York City's history. It was first proposed in the 1950s. It began construction in 1970. It is still under construction. When finished, it will have run 60 miles through solid bedrock, from the upstate reservoirs down through the Bronx, Manhattan, and Brooklyn, joining the city's 2 older water tunnels, which were built in 1917 and 1937. Water tunnel number 3 runs directly through Manhattan schist. Water tunnel number 3 is, in a true sense, a buried tunnel through the buried rock that holds the city up. The buried water tunnel number 3 will be approximately 700 feet below sea level at its deepest point in the Bronx, deeper than any other tunnel in North America. The buried tunnel is wide enough to drive a truck through. The buried tunnel was being worked on while you listened to this story. Work continues, in shifts, 24 hours a day. The buried tunnel is the most expensive piece of buried infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere. Water tunnel number 3 intersects the buried city in some surprising ways. While being drilled under the Bronx in the 1990s, the tunnel intersected a buried glacial pothole, a roughly cylindrical cavity in the schist that had been hollowed out under the weight of the Wisconsin ice sheet. The pothole had been filled with ancient groundwater that had been locked there for thousands of years. The buried pothole water, when the tunnel breached it, rushed into the tunnel under enormous pressure. The city spent months pumping the pothole water out and stabilizing the tunnel around the pothole. The buried pothole is now part of the buried city. Under Manhattan, water tunnel number 3 also passes through, or close to, several of the buried neighborhoods we mentioned. It runs under Washington Heights, it runs under Harlem, it runs under Morningside Heights, it runs under the Upper East Side, it runs under Midtown. The buried tunnel passes under or near the buried gneiss outcrops of Morningside Heights. The buried tunnel passes under the buried Seneca Village. The buried tunnel passes under the buried creek that ran through Harlem. The buried tunnel passes under the buried aqueducts. The buried tunnel passes under the buried schist. The fact that water tunnel number 3 was being built while other buried infrastructure was aging is one of the city's durable problems. Water tunnel number 1, completed in 1917, is 100 years old. Water tunnel number 2, completed in 1937, is almost 90 years old. Both are showing their age. There have been significant breaks in both tunnels in recent decades, with serious water main breaks cascading into the streets above the tunnels. The buried water mains come up to the surface regularly during emergencies. The buried city, when it cracks, opens directly into the surface city. Some of the older buried water mains are exposed to the surface. They are buried, but they are also public. They are part of the city's geology walks. Some of them are integrated into museum exhibits at the New York City Water Tunnel Number 3 Visitor Center beneath the Van Cortlandt Park golf course. Visitors can walk through educational displays set into the actual shaft of the working tunnel. Visitors can see the buried wall of the tunnel. Visitors can see in cross-section the buried schist around the tunnel. The buried city has turned, in places, into its own museum. New York's hidden underground is also a world of curiosities. There are, beneath Manhattan, several partially buried mechanical marvels. There is, beneath the Brooklyn Bridge, the mechanism of the original 1869 wooden bridge anchor system, partly functional, partly museum, sitting in a vault beneath the Brooklyn side anchorage. Tourists can visit the anchor vaults. The anchor vaults are, in a sense, a buried piece of the bridge that no longer activates. There is, beneath the Manhattan anchorage of the Brooklyn Bridge, an equivalent set of anchor vaults, smaller, mostly closed to visitors, but with the original inclined approach ramp still in place. There is, beneath the Williamsburg Bridge anchorage on the Manhattan side, a similar set of buried anchor vaults, including the buried mechanism by which the bridge was originally designed to swing open for tall-masted vessels, a function it lost in the early 20th century when ships stopped needing to pass through. There is, beneath the Woolworth building, above the buried caissons, a subterranean machine room that pumps water service upward through the building's plumbing. The Woolworth Building's buried machine room is itself a working museum of early 20th century engineering, a buried piece of New York's mechanical heritage. There is, beneath 30 Rockefeller Plaza, an extensive subterranean complex of television studios, sealed passages, conveyor systems, ice storage plants. Rockefeller Center is essentially a small underground city of its own, connected by long buried passageways. During the Second World War, the buried Rockefeller complex was connected by buried ramp to a secret underground emergency operations center, the predecessor of the modern New York City Emergency Management Bunker. itself buried deep in the bedrock beneath the World Trade Center site. The buried bunkers beneath Lower Manhattan form a system of their own. The original Federal Emergency Operations Center, built in the 1950s and 1960s, sits beneath the Verizon building at 375 Pearl Street in deeply reinforced chambers carved out of the schist. The buried chamber is the underground crisis center of the city. The buried chamber was put into use during September 11, 2001, and during Hurricane Sandy. The buried chamber has its own air filtration. The buried chamber has its own generator. The buried chamber is, in every meaningful sense, the buried room in which the city plans its survival. The buried city's deepest constructions are not all infrastructure. Some of them are art. The buried 14th Street subway station, planned but never built. The buried subway art pieces in the new 2nd Avenue subway stations, some of which are installed in places the public will never see, in maintenance rooms, in utility shafts, in workers' corridors. The buried art is part of the buried city's archive of attempts to mark the underground as a human space. We should also note, for completeness, the buried city's quieter pathology. The buried city includes buried secrets. The buried city includes buried infrastructure that the city's government would prefer we did not study too closely. The buried city includes buried records. The buried city includes buried informal economies. The buried city includes the buried labor of undocumented workers deep in the tunnels, doing work the surface city does not always wish to consider. Many of the people doing the actual burying and unburying of New York have, themselves, been buried in America's wider economic history. The buried city is, in its own way, an economy that has not been acknowledged above ground. We are almost back to the surface. Let us bring the descent to a close. The buried city is patient. The buried city does not hurry. It does not advertise. It does not even, mostly, see the light. The buried city simply waits, beneath your feet, for the next layer. Tonight, in this story, the buried city has waited for us. We have climbed down through it gently, and we have now climbed back up. We are standing on the surface again. We are standing on the latest layer. We are standing on the still warm concrete of a recent repaving. The buried city is patient. The buried city will wait again. Sleep now. Sleep on the soft, layered thing. Sleep on the layered bedrock, the layered clay, the layered fill, the layered pipes, the layered bones. The buried city does not let anyone fall through. The buried city has held everyone who has lived here for 4 centuries. The buried city will hold you. Beneath you, the schist. Beneath you, the water. Beneath you, the bones. Beneath you, the slow breathing of the buried city, sleep. There is more to hear descending if we keep listening. The buried L is among the most physiological of the city's layered memories. 3 elevated lines once stitched Manhattan together in a different rhythm than the subway does today. The 9th Avenue L ran from South Ferry up the west side, terminating at 155th Street. The 6th Avenue L ran from the Battery up the middle of the island. The 3rd Avenue L ran above 3rd Avenue from South Ferry to the Bronx. The Ls carried millions of riders for nearly a century. They were dark, loud, and they cast chains of shadow on the avenues beneath. Then, beginning in the late 1930s and continuing into the 1940s, the Ls were taken down. The city demolished them. The steel was sold for scrap, the stations were demolished, the columns were removed. The roots of those columns, however, were not entirely removed. Beneath the avenues, beneath the sidewalks, beneath the modern pavement, the buried concrete piers of the elevated railways are still there, partly preserved, partly sliced, partly sealed. If you walk along 3rd Avenue in the Bronx today, between the mid-block parking lots and the small shops, you are walking above the buried roots of an elevated railway that carried your grandparents to work. The buried L is a sleepier buried thing than the subway because no one is rushing to re-excavate it. But the buried concrete is in the ground. It will be in the ground long after this story is forgotten, still waiting under the city, pedestrian bridges, lost skywalks, removed overpasses. There is the buried Cromwell Bridge, an old connection that ran between Queens and Manhattan across the East River at a level no longer used. There are buried ferry terminals. There are buried pier sheds, dismantled after the waterfront lost its working role. There is buried evidence of Pier 17 at the South Street Seaport, demolished and reconstructed twice. There is buried evidence of the West Side Highway collapse, which occurred on December 15, 2013, more than 40 years after the elevated section of the West Side Highway was closed because of neglect, and which left a permanent scar on the buried approach columns beneath the surface road. The buried road failures of New York don't usually kill the buried city. They add to it. They bury more infrastructure. The buried cemeteries of Greater New York extend across all 5 boroughs. The largest cemetery system in the United States is on Long Island, but Queens and Brooklyn also contain more than 50 historical burial grounds, several of which are in sealed, overgrown plots that few walkers ever notice. The Evergreen Cemetery in Brooklyn, established in 1849, contains more than 500,000 burials. The Cypress Hills Cemetery, straddling the Brooklyn-Queens border and dating to 1848, is the resting place of several dozen notable 19th-century New Yorkers. The Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, founded in 1863, holds more than 300,000 burials on a hilltop where the geological foundation is granite gneiss, the same Fordham gneiss that appears on the surface in Upper Manhattan. Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, founded in 1838, holds more than 560,000 burials on a hilltop of glacial till overlooking the buried Gowanus lowlands. These cemeteries are not buried. They are among the surface expressions of the buried city, but they are the most direct physical markers of how much death the surface city is layered on. The dead of New York, conservatively estimated, exceed 6 million. The buried dead of New York dominate the stratigraphy of the surface. Staten Island has its own buried stratigraphy. Fresh Kills on the western shore of Staten Island was, for half a century, the largest landfill in the world. Fresh Kills opened in 1948 as a temporary municipal landfill and then became permanent, accepting the daily garbage of New York City through 2001 when, after the attacks of September 11, the city briefly considered using the landfill as a repository for the World Trade Center debris. Fresh Kills is now being converted into Fresh Kills Park, which, when complete, will be roughly 3 times larger than Central Park. The buried Fresh Kills is the most massive single buried object in New York. Its buried mass exceeds 100 million tons of compacted refuse. It rises more than 200 feet above sea level, in places, an entirely mountainous body. The buried Fresh Kills mountain is held together by buried methane, which the landfill captures and burns. The buried Fresh Kills mountain is a buried structure that has shaped the local weather. The buried Fresh Kills mountain is, after the burial of Seneca Village, the most profound reordering of a local landscape in modern New York. Mount Loretto, also on Staten Island, was a former Roman Catholic orphanage and sanitarium which closed in the 1970s and which now sits partly abandoned on a hilltop above the buried waterways of the Arthur Kill. Mount Loretto is the burial of an institutional landscape. The buried institutional landscapes of New York are extensive. They include the buried campus of the Brooklyn State Hospital, partly demolished and partly buried. They include the buried asylum buildings on Roosevelt Island, including the smallpox hospital ruins and the remains of the New York City Lunatic Asylum, the burial of 19th century mental institutions. They include the buried buildings of the New York House of Refuge on Randall's Island, partly sunk into the buried tidal marsh on which the island sits. They include the buried buildings of the Old Naval Hospital on the same island. The buried institutions of New York form a layer of their own, a layer of forced reclusion that was generally considered by those who imposed it to be invisible, and that is now mostly invisible above ground. The buried military installations are extensive. Beneath Fort Totten in Queens sits a battery position that was constructed in the 1860s and reinforced through the Spanish-American War. Beneath Fort Schuyler in the Bronx sits a coastal defense battery built using the buried glacial till of the surrounding land. The buried military installations include a series of coastal defense sites, several of which were decommissioned after the Second World War and partially buried under subsequent residential development. There is, beneath the Bronx, a buried Nike missile site, completed in the 1950s and decommissioned in the 1960s. There are buried Nike missile sites in Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island as well, all of which housed nuclear-armed anti-aircraft missiles during the 1956 through 1974 period. The buried missile silos are, today, sometimes converted to data centers, sometimes converted to community gardens, sometimes simply buried again under grass. The buried missile infrastructure is one of the most recent military layers of the buried city. The buried infrastructure of the city's environmental systems is also extensive. There is, beneath the green infrastructure of recent decades, buried geocellular storage underneath parks, beneath plazas, beneath playgrounds. There is, beneath the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, buried cisterns that capture rainwater for reuse. There is, beneath Bryant Park, a buried cistern that catches stormwater and slowly releases it through the subsoil. There is, beneath the High Line, an integrated buried drainage system that helps the elevated park absorb rain rather than running off into the buried sewer. The buried green infrastructure of New York is a recent layer of the buried city, and it is the first buried layer that is also self-consciously ecological. The buried green infrastructure helps the buried city breathe. The buried cultural infrastructure of the city is also extensive. There is, beneath Carnegie Hall, a buried vault system that supports the structural loadings of the concert hall. There is, beneath Lincoln Center, a buried drainage system that handles overflow from the reflecting pool. There is, beneath the New York Public Library, a buried sub-basement that contains the heating plant for the entire main branch. There is, beneath the Brooklyn Public Library at Grand Army Plaza, a buried auxiliary stack extension completed in 1970 that holds additional archive material and is accessible only by staff. The buried libraries of New York are stacked deeper than most people ever think, and the buried stacks at the main branch of the New York Public Library extend, in places, almost as far down as the buried Croton Reservoir's bottom slab. The buried schools are extensive as well. The buried basements and buried sub-basements of New York's public schools contain extensive mechanical systems, including coal bunkers, oil tanks, and asbestos sealed behind locked doors, abandoned air handling equipment. The buried schools of New York also contain buried artifacts, sealed study halls, sealed gymnasiums that have not been used in decades. The buried school infrastructure is, in part, why New York has so much difficulty modernizing its infrastructure. The buried school basement can sometimes contain materials that the modern city is not yet able to remove. The buried transportation infrastructure extends further still. There is the buried rail freight terminal that operated beneath Gansevoort Street in Manhattan until the 1980s, and that is now partly underneath the Whitney Museum's footprint and partly underneath the High Line. There is, beneath Brooklyn, the buried Bush Terminal Rail Yard, which once handled enormous volumes of freight between the harbor and the rest of the country, and which is now buried under the partially redeveloped Industry City complex. There is, beneath the Bronx, the buried Harlem River Rail Yard that once connected to the Putnam Line, and that is now buried beneath a combination of public housing, parks, and limited industrial use. The buried rail yards of New York are some of the largest flat areas in the modern city, and they are also where the recent buried land use is most rapidly changing. The buried signals infrastructure of New York is also vast. Beneath every signalized intersection, beneath every highway ramp, beneath every transit station are hundreds of miles of signal cable, traffic detection loops, train control blocks, and emergency override circuits. Buried signals are the nervous system of the invisible transport city. Buried cables that once carried telegraph traffic, in some cases installed fresh as recently as the 1990s, still lie beneath the streets as fallback signal circuits. The buried signal network is a quiet kind of continuity. The buried grid that holds the moving city still, buried waterways, including the buried creek of the Bronx River, the buried creek of Westchester Creek, and the buried creek of the Hutchinson River continue to flow even though they have been heavily modified. Every buried North River tributary contributes to the waters that, at the surface, push up through sewer grates during heavy rains. The buried creeks are also part of the population's mental map of the city. New Yorkers often know the buried creek system better than the buried subway system because the buried creeks shape the neighborhoods they live in, both atmospherically and economically. The neighborhood of Maspeth in Queens lies in the buried watershed of Newtown Creek. The neighborhood of Bayside lies in the buried watershed of Little Neck Bay. The neighborhood of City Island is a buried surface of former oyster shell land in the western Long Island Sound. New York also holds ecologies. The buried soil microbiome of New York is a real and ongoing layer with its own composition, distinct from the surface soil. The buried soil microbiome governs the rate at which buried metal corrodes, the rate at which buried stone weathers, and the chemical composition of buried water. The buried soil microbiome is itself quiet, contained, and largely out of sight. The buried geological signature of New York, beyond Manhattan schist, includes the buried serpentinite outcrops that appear in Upper Manhattan, and the buried amphibolite that varies across the Bronx, and the buried sandstone that underlies Staten Island. Each rock tells a different story of ancient seabed, ancient collision, ancient erosion. The buried rocks of New York collectively map the closing of the Iapetus Ocean roughly 460 million years ago, the subsequent opening of the Atlantic Ocean roughly 180 million years ago, the passage of the dinosaurs in the Mesozoic, and the long quiet story of the Cenozoic that led, eventually, to the appearance of the buried humans under Washington Square Park. The buried humans of New York did not appear there accidentally. The buried humans appeared because the surface New York built itself too quickly. The buried humans were buried by the speed of the city's expansion, which often outpaced the city's capacity to plan cemeteries, to maintain graveyards, and to identify remains. The buried humans of New York are, in a quiet way, the price of the buried progress that made modern Manhattan possible. We are coming close to the end of this particular descent. The descent is perhaps too long. The descent can be perhaps lighter. Let us lighten. The buried city does not always have to be heavy. The buried city is also a kind of comic archive. The buried city contains buried vending machines from the 1970s that still sit behind locked panels in some station mezzanines. The buried city contains buried newspaper vending boxes, sometimes older versions of the same New York dailies. The buried city contains buried billiards halls, sealed after several generations of use. The buried city contains buried shoeshine stands, abandoned under bridge approaches. The buried city contains buried objects whose origin has been entirely lost. The buried city contains one object in particular about which the Metropolitan Transportation Authority is famously uncertain. The object is a small copper box, sealed beneath the second level of a station, discovered by accident during recent electrical renovation. The sealed box, opened under official supervision, contained a letter dated 1927, a sample of coal, and a small American flag. The buried box is not large. The buried box is not historically significant in the sense of a constitutional document. But the buried box is part of the buried city's archive of decisions and gestures, large and small, that have been sealed into the city's strata. The buried city also contains buried jokes. There are, beneath several stations of the New York City subway, the names of the construction gangs carved in chalk on the tunnel walls. The names of the construction gangs are sometimes elaborate, sometimes witty, and seldom scrubbed out. The carved names of the construction gangs are part of the buried city's graffiti history, predating the more famous work on the Freedom Tunnel walls by more than a generation. The carved names are sometimes rediscovered by crews cleaning out a tunnel section, and the carved names are photographed by the crews, added to the buried city's archive. The buried names of the gangs of 1903 are still being read occasionally, more than 100 years after they were written. The buried city also contains buried coin. It is estimated that several $100,000 in coins are buried each year beneath the city, mostly in subway fare gates, mostly in parking meter collection vaults, mostly in toll booth coin return slots that no longer return coins. The buried coin of New York represents an enormous sum over time. The buried coin is the surface city's permanent tip jar for the maintenance crews. We have been talking a long time. The story, like a tunneling machine, advances slowly through a hard medium. Let us rest for a moment. Let us breathe. Here is a brief, soft summary of what we have walked through calmly tonight in this slow journey through the buried river, the buried pond, the buried creek, the buried marsh, past the buried cemetery, the buried graveyard, the buried potter's field, the buried African burial ground, the unmarked burial ground, the partly preserved burial ground, among the buried quarry, the buried brick kiln, the buried ice house, the buried gas plant, the buried coal bunker, The buried oil tank beneath the buried aqueduct, the buried water tunnel, the buried sewer, the buried storm system, the buried chiller plant, the buried steam tunnel, beyond the buried pneumatic, the buried cable, the buried rail, the buried siding, the buried freight yard, the buried station, the buried tunnel. Over the buried schist, the buried gneiss, the buried marble, the buried till, the buried clay, the buried fill, inside the buried Lenape, the buried Dutch, the buried English, the buried colonial, the buried immigrant, the buried African, the buried Irish, the buried Italian, the buried Puerto Rican, across the buried horse, the buried mule, the buried cow, the buried pig, the buried rat, the buried pigeon, the buried sparrow, through the buried bullet, the buried cannonball, the buried weapon, the buried cartridge, the buried missile, past the buried brick, the buried stone, the buried timber, the buried iron, the buried steel, the buried concrete, the buried tile, the buried terracotta, among the buried poem, the buried novel, the buried letter to a lover, the buried letter to a creditor, the buried letter to the future. Beneath the buried signature, the buried initial, the buried monogram, the buried chalk mark, the buried thumbprint, beyond the buried flower, the buried tree root, the buried seed, the buried bulb, the buried worm, the buried beetle, the buried ant. The buried city holds all of these and more, and it does not hurry, and it does not care how you pronounce them. The buried city is, in the simplest and most truthful sense, everything New York has ever done. The buried city is the archive of New York's acts. Tonight, you have descended through part of that archive, gently, at a pace meant for sleep, and we have now, like a slow elevator, come back up to the surface. The surface is the place where the sun still rises, and where the wind still moves, and where the birds still fly overhead. The surface is the most recent layer. The surface is, in its own way, also going to be buried, one day, by something we cannot yet name, but tonight it is not. Tonight it is fresh. Tonight it is the layer you are sleeping on. Beneath you, the schist. Beneath you, the buried city. Above you, the surface. Above you, the soft ceiling of the present. Above you, the quiet breathe, sleeve. There is one more slow descent available to us before we stop, and it is the descent through the buried tide. The buried tide is real. Beneath the East River, beneath the Hudson, beneath the Harlem River, beneath the Kill Van Kull, beneath the Arthur Kill, the tide moves twice a day, as it always has, against buried bulkheads, buried pilings, buried cribs, buried dolphins, buried stone and timber dolphins that once served as docking points for sailing ships, and that are still standing in the dark water, mostly unvisited, mostly unstudied, mostly invisible to any sonar that anyone has bothered to run. The buried tide is also the tide that kept rising higher and higher against Lower Manhattan for the first 3 centuries of the city's history, lapping at buried street ends, lapping at buried bulkhead lines, lapping at buried seawall stones that had been placed to keep the tide out. The buried seawall stones of Lower Manhattan are, in places, more than 100 years old. The buried seawall stones are essentially below grade now, with the modern landfill having buried them beneath the pavement. The buried seawall stones were a different age's emergency response to the buried tide. The buried tide is still there. There are buried wharves, too, beneath the East River. The buried wharf timbers of the colonial East River waterfront, including timbers that were used in the construction of the original slips of New Amsterdam. The buried wharves of the colonial waterfront are now beneath streets like Pearl Street, beneath South Street, beneath Front Street, beneath Water Street. The buried wharves are the foundation of the city's oldest, most basic commercial district, and they are now mostly buried beneath asphalt and partly beneath current commercial buildings. The buried wharves are some of the most thoroughly archaeological heavy layers in Lower Manhattan, and they have been the subject of repeated, often aborted, excavation projects. The buried wharves of New Amsterdam have been intermittently studied since the 1970s. The buried wall of City Hall Park, sometimes called the city's buried colonial fence, also exists, though it is less famous. The buried walls of City Hall Park are remnants of a defensive structure built in the 17th century, deep beneath the park's modern surface. The buried walls of City Hall Park are also foundation remnants of an almshouse, a jail, a powder magazine, and an early city hall, all buried beneath the present City Hall Park. City Hall Park is itself a buried site of multiple earlier civic buildings. The buried City Hall is the heart of the buried civic geography of Manhattan. The buried colonial foundation stones of the city's First Trinity Church are still visible in places deep within Trinity Churchyard. The buried foundation stones are a marker of the original parish of Trinity, which was located at a slightly different position from the present church. The buried stones of the original Trinity Church help date the city's built environment with an unusual precision, since each burial, each rebuilding, each movement of stone has been carefully documented since the 1690s. The buried walls of Fort George, the original Dutch fort at the southern tip of Manhattan, are also still physically present. The buried Fort George, which served as the seat of colonial government until the British assumed control in 1664, is partly visible inside the foundations of a present-day office building, and the remainder is buried beneath the pavement of the Battery Park area. The buried Fort George was the site of the city's first major political address, delivered by Peter Stuyvesant in 1664 in a buried meeting hall in front of a buried audience, of whom at least some members had been buried themselves in subsequent centuries. The buried armorers' workshops of the lower city are real. The buried outfitters and trade shops, the buried cooperatives, the buried goldsmith shops, the buried silversmith shops, all of them contribute to the buried craft geography of the 17th and 18th century city. If we could compile an archaeological atlas of Lower Manhattan, it would be largely made of buried commercial workshops, each one marked by a particular kind of buried refuse, by buried offcuts, by buried hammers. The buried clay tobacco pipes of New York's colonial period are abundant in the buried city. The buried clay tobacco pipe fragments are often the most precise dating evidence archaeologists have for any particular buried site, since the styles of clay pipe bowls changed quickly through the 17th and 18th centuries, and each layer of buried pipes roughly dates the deposition. The buried clay pipes are a kind of punctuation in the buried city's archive. The buried clay pipes help us read the buried city, layer by layer, with precision. The buried coins of the colonial city are similarly useful. The buried coins of the buried city are sometimes the only fiscal evidence we have for the timing of buried transactions. The buried coins of New York, in carefully tabulated collections, are a kind of ancient financial record with sterling and Spanish reals and English halfpennies and American cents, all of them buried in the dirt of the buried city. The buried bones of the city's colonial fauna are present everywhere archaeologists have looked in Lower Manhattan, including buried horse bones, buried cow bones, buried pig bones, buried chicken bones, buried fish bones. The buried fauna of the buried city includes buried oysters, buried clams, buried mussels, each of which is associated with a buried commercial district that no longer exists on the surface. The buried oysters of New York's colonial harbor are now the subject of active efforts to restore the living oyster population of New York Harbor, which is itself, in a sense, a kind of exhumation of the buried oyster. The buried pockets of ancient soil, sometimes called buried A horizons, run beneath Manhattan at various depths. The buried A horizons are pockets of pre-development topsoil, often only a few inches to a few feet in vertical extent, sometimes preserved in sealed pockets where the modern city has not yet fully developed. The buried A horizons, when they exist, are useful archives of what the surface ecology looked like before the Dutch arrived. The buried A horizons have not been mapped comprehensively, but they have been recovered at dozens of construction sites, often from sealed refuse pits, where they have been preserved by anaerobic conditions. The buried paleochannels of the East River, including the buried paleochannels that ran through the bedrock beneath Wall Street, are present in the geological literature of the city. The buried paleochannels are not recent water channels, but very ancient water channels, formed when the relative sea level of the Atlantic was different, sometimes millions of years ago, when the rivers running into what we now call the East River took substantially different paths. The buried paleochannels help constrain the deep history of Manhattan. The buried glacial striations on exposed Manhattan schist surfaces that were later buried by construction are significant. The buried glacial striations are parallel scratches cut into the schist by rocks embedded in the base of the Wisconsin ice sheet, marking the direction of glacial movement. They are small, they are also numerous. The buried glacial striations are preserved on buried schist outcrops throughout Upper Manhattan, and they are sometimes encountered in the construction of high-rise foundations. The buried striations are one of the most subtle geological signatures of the buried city. There is a buried line in the city that runs from City Hall up through Midtown, roughly following the spine, and that represents the approximate buried divide between the buried East River drainage and the buried Hudson drainage on the Manhattan of the Ice Age. The buried divide ran roughly along what is now Fifth Avenue north of 59th Street, although there were several buried secondary drainage channels on both sides. The buried divide governs, in part, the modern sewer drainage of the city. The buried divide is a hydrological feature of the buried city that no one thinks about except the engineers. The buried hydrology of the buried city is complex. There are buried aquifers in the glacial sand and gravel layers of Manhattan and the Bronx. There are buried confining layers of clay. There are buried perching conditions in the buried soil horizons. The buried hydrology is a full, functioning ecosystem that operates continuously beneath the modern surface. The buried hydrology is sometimes active enough that buried construction conditions need to consider in advance the buried water table. The buried air quality of the deep Manhattan schist is a thing of some interest to environmental engineers. The buried air is not exactly fresh. The buried air contains buried radon, which has been a matter of public health concern for the borough of Manhattan since the late 20th century. The buried air in tunnels sometimes contains higher concentrations of buried radon than the surface air. The buried air is sometimes monitored with buried sensors. The buried air of Manhattan is a small but persistent signal of the radioactive decay of buried uranium in the buried schist. The buried fungi of the buried city are present. The buried fungal communities in the buried wood of the buried pier timbers include species that are not known to exist on the surface, preserved in the dark, damp, buried conditions. The buried fungi of the buried city have been the subject of limited but intriguing scientific study, with several new species described from buried timber in the buried foundations of Manhattan. The buried fungi are a small part of the buried city's biological archive. The buried insects of the buried city include buried beetles, buried ants, buried flies, each of which provides, when recovered, a small but precise marker of the buried ecological conditions at the time of burial. The buried insects are sometimes used by archaeologists to fingerprint the buried environment with extraordinary precision. The buried insects of the buried city are among the most useful archive data of the buried city's history. The buried bacteria of the buried city have been the subject of a long-running, currently active research project by environmental microbiologists at several institutions, who have been sampling buried bacteria from several buried locations, including buried schist groundwater, buried sediment layers, and buried sewer biofilm. The buried bacteria of the buried city include both common surface species and specialized subsurface species, including strains that are uniquely adapted to the buried chemistry of the buried New York groundwater. The buried bacteria of the buried city are a functioning, biologically diverse ecosystem that no one ever sees. The buried ecology of Manhattan is, in sum, real, present, and ongoing. The buried ecology of Manhattan represents the most recent of the buried cities, because the buried ecology is the layer underneath the buried pavement and the buried infrastructure. The buried ecology is alive, and the buried ecology will continue to live after the buried city is rebuilt. We have descended quite far. We have descended through the buried tide, the buried wharves, the buried colonial foundations, the buried fauna, the buried flora, the buried clay pipes, the buried coins, the buried hydrology, the buried paleo channels, the buried glaciers, and the buried bacteria. We have descended to the buried living layer beneath the buried pavement. We are now going to ascend gently, slowly. We are going to take a long breath. We are going to invite sleep. We are going to ascend through one more layer of the city, the layer of surface quiet that we are now restoring. The surface layer is quieter tonight than usual. The surface layer has been, briefly, modified by the slow descent. The surface layer does not yet know what it is sitting on top of. The surface layer is grateful, in its quiet way, to be still solid. The surface layer will remember our descent, briefly, in the form of a soft mental image of the buried city. The surface layer will then forget, briefly, because the surface layer forgets easily. The surface layer is not the buried city. The surface layer is what gets restitched when the surface layer is patched. The surface layer is fresh asphalt that contains, in its matrix, particles of older asphalt from prior patches, all the way down to the buried cobblestones of the 19th century. The surface layer is, in fact, the oldest of the recent layers, in the form of buried materials rolled into its body. The surface layer carries, in its grain, the buried city. When the surface layer is fully patched, when the buried city has been pushed fully down into the buried city, when the present is now standing on top of the past, we are sleeping again, and the buried city is again below us, and we are again part of the most recent layer, we are again part of the most recent layer. Beneath us, the buried city sleeps. Beneath us, the schist holds. The story is, now, very small. The story has narrowed, slowly, like a river narrowing as it runs out of high country. The story is a hum. The story is the warm air in the room where you are lying. The story is a city with no traffic on it. The story is the slow, dark, gentle weight of a quilt. The story is just the buried city, sleeping beneath us. Through the rest of the night, the buried city will continue to do what it always does. The buried water will continue to rise and fall in its buried creeks. The buried tunnel will continue to wait beneath Atlantic Avenue. The buried chandeliers will continue to hang at City Hall. The buried piano will continue to sit beneath Broadway. The buried tracks of Track 61 will continue to wait beneath the Waldorf Astoria. The buried Seneca Village will continue to rest beneath the Great Lawn. The buried African burial ground will continue to hold its 419 ancestors, and it will continue to keep the rest, in silence, beneath the federal building above it. The buried bones of Washington Square will continue to lie beneath the granite fountain. The buried trench of the buried Broadway pneumatic will continue to curve below the modern trains. The buried schist will continue to hold. The buried ice that shaped the buried city will continue to exist, deep inside the rock, as the fossil memory of ice that is no longer moving. The buried city is one long act of memory. The buried city is the city's autobiography. We have walked through several of its chapters tonight, and we have done it slowly, the way one walks through a museum that is open at night. We have walked through the chapter of the buried Lenape. We have walked through the chapter of the buried Dutch. We have walked through the chapter of the buried English. We have walked through the chapter of the buried African. We have walked through the chapter of the buried Civil War. We have walked through the chapter of the buried immigrant city. We have walked through the chapter of the buried industrial city. We have walked through the chapter of the buried 20th century. We have walked through the chapter of the buried 21st century. Each chapter has now been written into a soft font on the soft surface of the night, like rain writing itself into a buried pavement. Now, the chapters are quiet. Now the buried city is at rest. Now the buried city is breathing in a way we cannot hear. The buried city is breathing in a way that does not need to be heard. The buried city is breathing slowly, and it is breathing well, and it is not in any hurry, and it does not need any of us to be in a hurry either. Tonight, we have descended. Tomorrow night, the buried city will still be there. The buried city is never going away. The buried city is too patient to leave. The buried city has waited since the ice retreated, and the buried city is waiting still, and the buried city will wait again. Tomorrow night, when, if you choose, you will descend with us once more, gently, slowly, into the hidden world beneath your own. For now, sleep, beneath you the city, above you the night, around you the small, quiet weight of a long and careful listening. The buried world rests with you. The buried world does not need anything from you tonight. The buried world is grateful that you came down. The buried world is grateful that you came down, and the buried world is now letting you go back up to the room, back up to the bed, back up to the slow in-breath and the slow out-breath, and the slow dimming of an attention that has been, briefly, very wide. You are coming up. You are coming up. You are almost here. You are here. Sleep then. Sleep among the buried layers of New York City. Sleep for a while. The buried city will hold you gently, the way it holds the rest. The buried city will hold you, and the buried city will not let you fall through. The buried city will hold you tonight, and tomorrow night, and the night after that, and the buried city will hold you for as long as you need. And the buried city is, also, very tired. The buried city wants you to sleep. The buried city wants you to rest on it. the soft way one rests on an old quilt, and the buried city will do its best to keep you warm tonight, the way it has kept the surface city warm for 4 centuries. You do not have to fall asleep. You can simply rest. The buried city understands the difference. The buried city knows that rest is its own slow thing. The buried city breathes. The buried city waits. The buried city is the soft underside of every street in New York. Tonight, if you live anywhere on Earth, and it doesn't matter where, the ground is older than you think. And underneath the older ground is older ground still. And underneath that is the schist, or the granite, or the sandstone, or the limestone, or the clay, or the sand. You sleep on top of older ground. You sleep on top of a buried city. You sleep on top of all the buried cities that have been, and all the buried cities yet to come. Slow down, let the breath shallow out. Let the shoulders settle, let the lower back soften against the surface. Let the eyes close. You don't have to stay, you don't have to wake. The buried city is the deepest possible bed, and it is patient and it has made room for you, and you are lying on it now. Seefs, 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 seefs. The buried city keeps one last, soft gift, and it is the gift of buried voices. Beneath the sidewalks of New York, far below the asphalt, preserved in the strata of the buried city, are the imprints of voices that have, in some cases, not spoken for a long time. The buried voices of the buried city include the voices of enslaved people buried in the African burial ground, whose physical bones were exhumed in the 1990s, whose descendants were sometimes identified, and whose names, when known, now appear on a memorial, which sits, in turn, above the bones of their anonymity. The buried voices also include the voices of the forgotten patients of Roosevelt Island's buried institutions, whose records were sealed, whose names were reduced to numbers, and whose stories were absorbed into the institutional paper that is itself buried in basement archives across the city. The buried voices include the voices of ship captains and harbor masters, embedded in the days logs of the Colonial Customs House, now preserved in sealed city archives. The buried voices include the voices of street vendors, of cab drivers, of night watchmen, of factory workers, of dock workers, of stock clerks, of newsboys, of paperboys, of department store cashiers. The buried voices do not literally make sound. They are not audibly present beneath the city. But the buried voices are still present in the city's chemical archive of memory. The buried voices are implicit in the buried cigarette butts. The buried voices are implicit in the buried chewing gum. The buried voices are implicit in the buried shoelaces. The buried voices are implicit in the buried needles, in the buried buttons, in the buried thimbles. Each one of these small buried artifacts saved a quiet moment of the buried city's past, and each one is a kind of buried witness. The buried witnesses of the buried city are countless, and most of them have been, for centuries, beneath us. We should also say a quiet word about the buried forgotten neighborhoods, because the buried city is, in part, a city of erased places whose names have been mostly forgotten. One of these is the buried village of Kips Bay, a small hamlet that once sat on a coastal inlet on the East River between what is now 33rd and 37th Streets. Kips Bay was a settlement of mixed-race Dutch and English colonists in the 17th century, and it was partly erased by the British during the Revolutionary War, partially destroyed by the construction of the East River Tidal Power Plant in the early 20th century, and almost entirely erased by the construction of the FDR Drive in the 1930s and 1940s. The buried archaeology of Kips Bay is significant. The buried Kips Bay hamlet survives only in archaeological reports and in occasional accidental exposures during utility work. The buried hamlet is one of dozens buried beneath the East Midtown waterfront. Then there is the buried black village of Sandy Ground on Staten Island, established after the Civil War by free black oyster fishermen from Maryland. Sandy Ground was a thriving community of more than 100 families through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with its own church, its own school, its own cemetery. The community declined in the 20th century as the oyster beds were depleted and the racial covenants of suburban Staten Island took hold. The buried Sandy Ground community is partly preserved in a small museum on Staten Island, and the buried community continues to inform the buried archaeology of the island's southern shore. Still another is the buried immigrant neighborhood of Kleindeutschland, or Little Germany, in the Lower East Side, which existed from roughly the 1840s through the 1890s. Kleindeutschland was destroyed in stages. First, a tornado-like event destroyed several blocks in 1888. Then the General Slocum disaster of 1904, in which a steamboat carrying members of the local German community caught fire on the East River, killed more than 1,000 people, and traumatized the neighborhood. Then the construction of the Williamsburg Bridge approach ramps in the 1900s and 1910s erased the remaining blocks. The buried Kleindeutschland sits beneath a section of what is now the East Village, the LES, and the Lower East Side that has been substantially rebuilt since. The buried Kleindeutschland community is now mostly memorialized in name only, on small neighborhood signs. There is also the buried African American community of Weeksville in Brooklyn, established in 1838 by free Black New Yorkers, and today mostly preserved in the Weeksville Heritage Center, a small museum complex carrying the surviving buried architecture of the original settlement. The buried Weeksville neighborhood comprises 4 still-standing wooden houses. One of them moved to the site from its buried original location. The buried Weeksville is one of the most visible of the buried communities of New York. And then there is the buried Bowery district of flaw houses, of which a small section is still visible above ground around the Bowery Mission and the Bowery Poetry Club. The buried Bowery sits beneath modern hospitality businesses and luxury developments. The buried Bowery survives in archival records. Then there is the buried industrial stretch of Long Island City, in which the buried waterfront of the East River has been the subject of recently renewed archaeological study. The buried Long Island City shoreline is one of the most actively investigated parts of the buried city today. The buried communities of New York, in sum, were many. The buried communities were Harlem's poor, before Harlem became a center of Black cultural life. The buried communities were the immigrant poor on the LES, before the LES became a center of immigrant cultural life. The buried communities were the African Americans who were pushed out of every neighborhood they ever built in New York, repeatedly, until the buried communities moved to Harlem, or the buried communities moved to Brooklyn, or the buried communities moved to Queens. The buried communities are not just architecture. The buried communities are also institutions. The buried communities are buried social clubs, buried churches, buried synagogues, buried lodges, buried dance halls, buried community gardens. The buried social clubs of Harlem include the famous Savoy Ballroom, demolished in 1958, the buried basement beneath the footprint of the new apartment building that replaced it. The buried churches include the Abyssinian Baptist Church's older building, demolished in the 1900s, partly preserved in fragmentary foundation stones beneath the present church's footprint. The buried synagogues include the former Eldridge Street Synagogue's buried mikvah, a ritual bath, intact under the new building. The buried dance halls include the Cotton Club, originally in Harlem, later in Midtown, now closed, with the buried building's foundations preserved beneath the present use of the site. The buried community gardens include hundreds of small, briefly held gardens that were lost to development. The buried gardens are particularly important to remember because, in many cases, they are the most recent buried layers in the buried city. The buried gardens of New York are buried sometimes only a few inches below the surface, just beneath a recent paving or a recent foundation excavation. There is more. There are buried newspapers, in part, preserved in basement archives. There are buried letters, in part, preserved in attic archives. There are buried photographs, sealed in reflectors, sealed in jewel boxes, sealed in lockets. There are buried baby carriages beneath several buildings in the LES, lost during early 20th century tenement fires and vacant lot wrestles. There are buried pets, in particularly heartfelt numbers, including the buried cats of the LES, the buried dogs of Brooklyn, the buried parakeets of Queens. There is buried furniture, sometimes intact, sometimes burnt, sometimes abandoned, sometimes stored. There is buried luggage, including a buried steamer trunk found during construction at the WTC site in 2002. There is buried musical instrument, including the buried pianos of saloons, the buried pianos of dance halls, the buried pianos of ferry landings, and the buried bagpipes of pipe bands that once played in the parks. There are buried bird cages, there are buried carriages, including an entire buried horse-drawn fire engine uncovered during construction on the Lower East Side in the 1990s. There are buried taxidermied fish. There are buried prize ribbons from county fairs held in Central Park in the 1880s. There are buried advertising signs of 19th century products, including nearly complete buried tin signs for cigars, for soaps, for saloons. There is even a buried saddlery preserved in the basement of a former carriage shop in Upper Manhattan. The buried city is, in short, full of tiny inheritances. The buried city has not forgotten any of the small things. The buried city has been a patient collector of lost objects for centuries. We thank the buried city, gently, for letting us go down into it for a while. The buried city has been waiting for visitors like us. The buried city has been waiting for descendants of the people whose things are buried in it. The buried city will continue to wait. Beneath us, the buried city is still. Above us, the night is quiet. Above us, the night is also patient. Tonight, the night is the soft, layered thing that holds us together. Tonight, the night is the soft quilt of the buried city. Tonight, the night is the slow breath of the schist. Tonight, the night is one more layer in a long stack of layers. Tonight, we are at the top of the stack, briefly, and then we are going to descend into sleep, and sleep will join the buried layers, and then we will be part of the buried layers for a brief while, and then we will rise again, and the buried layers will remain. That is the loop. That is the soft, slow, repeated loop of the buried city and the surface city. The buried city descends. The surface city rises. The buried city waits. The surface city forgets. The buried city is patient, Salif, now. The story is over, Salif, now. The buried city is resting, Salif, now. The buried city is on your side.